actually read one of the papers you
Okay,
linked.
hello everyone, we're live. Sorry to cut you off, Vikram. So a while ago, and by a while ago, I think I mean yesterday, I wrote a beautiful article that many people are giving me a lot of credit for, where people are saying I did more for the case for theism than any other person since Abraham Lincoln. So I read a piece where I argued for the existence of God, and lots of people, they disagreed with my piece. They said, no, there is no God. And so I decided that I would respond to the critics. So I just did a live show. Well, not really a live show, like a YouTube stream where just anyone can come on and argue about it. So yeah, Vikram has joined, and Yitz Friedman. How are you folks doing?
As well as I could be.
Yitz Friedman, you're muted. Wow, Yitz Friedman really collapsing. Okay, Patrick asks, how did the article spark this exactly? Well, I got exactly 1 billion comments, so I decided that I would respond to the comments. Okay, Vikram, so you're on first. So where does my massive jumble of a million different arguments for God go wrong?
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of your arguments take the form of we have to make some big assumption to get out of a skeptical hypothesis. And we have to invent some explanation for this assumption because we don't have evidence to back it up. So we have to use God as the explanation for this. And I searched your articles, and it seems like that's kind of just based on you being incredulous at the possibility of skepticism. But I've never seen you give a good defense. The best thing you do is to cite this humor paper, and I actually read it for once, which is a big deal for me because I hate reading.
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't seem to support you that much.
Okay,
but I guess the main point I wanted to make is it seems like you have a sample of one problem, which is that you're like, our experiences are very, very thorough and rich and like big, so we need a God to explain this. But if you only have a sample of one kind of conscious experience, you have no idea how unique or impressive our experiences are in the context of any possible experience. We might be like 0.001% of how conscious we could be.
Okay, so I disagree that most of the arguments are of the form theism is the only way to get you out of a skeptical scenario. I think there was one argument that was like that, which was the argument that theism is the best explanation of why we're not in a skeptical scenario. And so that is an argument of that form. But I don't think most of the arguments were like that. Now, I'd be happy to address why I think we're not in a skeptical scenario. Let me make 4 points. The first one is I think that you should trust that things are the way that they seem, unless you're given a very strong reason to doubt it. And it really seems like we're not in a skeptical scenario. It really seems like, for example, the sun will rise tomorrow, the external world exists, you're really talking to me. So I think we would need a very strong reason to give it up. We'd have to appeal to something more convincing than it. Second, I think a skeptical scenario is not a good explanation of our experiences. So our experience, the world as it's presented to us through our senses, it presents itself as if it's this rich, organized, integrated version of reality where there aren't little random patches or blips back and forth. This is not what we would expect on most skeptical scenarios. If, for example, we're Boltzmann brains, then we would expect to notice, to just see maybe things would appear one way for a second, but then we'd notice ourselves rapidly asphyxiating. We'd see random splotches of color. We wouldn't have a clear, coherent, cohesive, unified picture of what the world looks like. The third point is that I think these skeptical scenarios, and this doesn't apply to all of them, but it applies to many of them, are less good of bets if you accept the self-indication assumption. So if, for example, you think we're brains and vats, the theory that there's just one guy in a brain in a vat makes it unlikely that I would be that one guy who's a brain in a vat. And so as a result, you should think that you're not in a skeptical scenario because they generally predict fewer people. Now, that won't apply to certain things like, say, modal realism, but even those go back to the first point about not explaining the character of our experience as well. And then the last point is even as apart from it making sense just to have a presumption of things being the way they appear, I think there are certain things that are just obvious that even if you don't know exactly how you know them, you can be really confident that you do know of them, and you can be more confident that you know of them than you can be in any of the reasons to doubt it. So imagine a scientist released a paper saying, some well-established mathematical result is false. We might say, even though we were pretty sure of that mathematical result, if someone convincingly argued against it, we might say, okay, there might be something actually wrong with it. In contrast, if someone wrote a paper saying the external world is fake, or the sun will not in fact rise tomorrow and everything will spontaneously implode in 1 second, we would, even if we didn't know exactly where their argument went wrong, we'd be really confident that it went wrong. So I think we can very easily Morian shift and say, look, I'm more confident that there's an external world than I am in any of the specific arguments for skepticism. I'm more confident that the sun will rise tomorrow than any argument for skepticism. And if a worldview is incapable of accommodating that because I'm sufficiently confident that the sun will rise tomorrow, that the external world is real, it gives me a reason to reject that worldview.
Sure. So, the fourth reason I agree with, I'm not sure you can then use that as like a bludgeon to establish a whole bunch of much more controversial things. You could say maybe, we have good reasons, overwhelming reasons to not be skeptics. But if we can't explain why we're not skeptics, I'm not sure we can use that to develop further things. One sec. I do want to say, I do think a lot of your arguments are in this vein. Like there's real stuff in the world. There's physical things in the world. That's a direct thing to like, oh, it's so weird that there's actual physical stuff. We're not purely mental. Why does our consciousness have psychophysical harmony? That relies on, there's no radical break between our consciousness and the world. We can't explain this, right? Which I think is the same vein. Like, why is our consciousness not totally uncorrelated with reality? So I kind of want to push back on the idea that that's the only thing you're arguing. It seems like a lot of your arguments fall in the same vein. And then on the substance of what you said, I guess I'd like maybe repeat what I said earlier. Like, you say our world is extremely, extremely rich, but I guess you have no way of knowing what the baseline for richness is. So like Humor gives the example of like an image with completely random pixels. And he says like, this is really whack. We're not like this. But, his comparator is like an actual image. We don't have like a super duper consciousness that we can compare ourselves to and be like, okay, or maybe a less organized consciousness, like a really, really bad one. And if you do have one, then it exists. So I'm not sure you can say that's something we're not, because it actually does exist. So I guess you have no way of saying our world is really rich because you have no comparator.
Okay, so you made 3 points. First, you suggested that we can't use us not being skeptics as evidence if the argument says that we're just automatically justified in thinking that we're not skeptics, just because it's sort of like a brute presumption because we can be really confident in it. But I think you can say, I'm really confident in this. I have a brute presumption in favor of this. And also a theory it's an advantage of a theory if it explains why it's the case, right? So I think that it's an advantage of a theory if it explains why we should think induction works, even if we already think that induction works, because it provides the deeper underlying account of induction working. It's similar to how the fact that I exist, I can be extremely confident that I exist. In fact, I am extremely confident that I exist. I'm pretty much certain of that. But the fact that I exist can be evidence for a theory because it's better explained by one theory. Similarly, we can be very confident that we're not skeptics, but our not being skeptics can be better explained by a theory. Second, you worry that the arguments, like the argument from from psychophysical harmony or from laws, rely on thinking we're not confident in skepticism. These are not arguments that it's not like if the physical world didn't exist, if there was no stuff, if there was nothing, if there was no consciousness, then we would be in a skeptical scenario. We wouldn't be around, right? So that's not any more of an argument from the falsity of skepticism, any more than it's an argument for the falsity of skepticism for me to say that from the fact that I exist, I get strong evidence that my parents didn't use effective contraception. Because if they had, it would be less likely that I exist. A world where I didn't exist, that's not a skeptical scenario, and it's one I know myself not to be in, but nonetheless, we can look for the most probable explanation of the fact that I do exist. And then lastly, you said we don't know what the baseline is for consciousness, and so we don't know that what our conscious experiences look like, that sort of like we don't have a comparison, so we don't know that whether they're splotchy in relation to something. But I don't think we need a comparison in order to make judgments about the unifiedness of our consciousness, right? So when I think about my experience, I have a rich integrated visual field. All the bits seem to fit together. It's not a bunch of random splotches of different things. It's coherent and unified. The things that I detect with one sense are the same as the things that I detect with my other senses. So, for example, if I see a wall and then I use my hands to feel the wall, it will have the same dimensions and it'll exist. Even if we like that, the point is that fact that it's not splotchy, the contents of the experience are not random, that fact is what cries out for explanation. And that fact is what's very poorly explained by most of the skeptical scenarios. By the way, Victor, I'm just for other people who are watching. So I wrote an article arguing for the existence of God, where I gave a bunch of arguments. That article is linked below. And then I decided that after I made the article, I would do sort of like a call-in show where people who disagreed with the things I say in the article could, come on and argue. So if you want to do that, the link to join is below. It's where it says, it has the StreamYard link and it says, come join and argue. So anyone who disagreed with the article is free to do that. Even if you haven't read the article, like if you disagree with something I'm saying, or just like, think there's no case for God or something, I'd be happy to walk through it. But yeah. Okay, Vikram. Sorry, continue.
I don't think I disagree that the SIA argument just from your own existence is different. That's not a kind of anti-skeptic argument because it's about your very existence, which would happen under skepticism anyways. I don't think the contraception stuff is like relevant to that because that's about like you existing as a human. But I agree with you there. You say we don't need like a comparator because we can tell our experiences are like unified. I guess you're saying unification is like a qualitative thing. You either have it or you don't, and it's overwhelmingly likely that you don't have it. I guess I don't really see it. Like we could have experiences that are a little unified, but much less unified than we have, or we could have experiences that are way, way more unified than what we have now. And the form this argument takes is that there's overwhelmingly more consciousness permutations that are disunified than are unified. But we don't even know what like the distribution of consciousness is. Like we have no way of determining that. So I guess like I understand that you're saying like we may be able to tell that we have some unification. Like if you have unification, you might be able to tell we have 5 unification, but we have no idea what that 5 means. Is that on the high end or the low end of a distribution?
So I think that we can have an intuition that something is very unified, even if we don't have a well worked out theory of exactly how unification works or of exactly what unification is. So, for example, suppose we come across something that looks like writing, and we see it has intricate marks scratched out. We could be confident that it's writing of some sort and that it's unified, even if we don't have an exact theory of how language works. And so if we just think about the fact that the vast majority of possible conscious experiences are random static, and that our conscious experience is not random static, then this is going to serve as evidence for or at least if on skeptical scenarios, they almost certainly would be random static. The fact that they're not random static, the fact that like just take the fact that I pointed to, which is that the things that we detect with one sense are the same as the things that we detect with another sense. So the things I see are the same as the things that I feel, are the same as the things that I hear sometimes. This fact is very surprising. Hey, Matthew and Philip. Philip, I can't tell. Are you my friend, Philip? The one who I know via Discord? Or are you... I think you are, but I'm not sure. Wow.
Oh, man.
And hi, Matthew. How are you? Why is everyone on mute? What's going on?
Philip is at the office.
Oh, Philip can't come online? Well, why did you join the live stream? OCIT.
Oh man. Well, I don't want to go over anyone if they want to talk. So Matthew, G. But
yeah, Matthew, do you have anything to say? You're muted. Yeah, weird. Yeah, Philip, you can view but not be on stage in two ways. One of them is you can just click the live stream link, which is on the YouTube channel Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions. And then the other way is I can just like kick you, remove you from the stage, which I'll do. Okay, and then you can just watch. But yeah. Okay. Wow, Matthew left. People are just dropping like flies. Oh, Tarn Somerville. How are you doing, Tarn Somerville?
Right now I'm frantically closing the YouTube link because that was way too much for my ears.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if Vikram is finished with that particular line, I'm happy to wait. If not, but
Vikram, are you finished with that particular line?
I guess like 15 seconds. I just want to say one thing. I think the writing example specifically is not good because the reason we know about writing is because we have hundreds of languages on Earth, whereas we have no comparators for other consciousness. And I think that's the key distinction I'm making.
Okay,
but
well, it doesn't have to be writing specifically. Yeah, it doesn't have to be writing specifically. So we can give it. So like, here's another example. There are lots of structures that you could imagine coming across on Mars where we would say, hey, this is definitely alien, even if we don't have examples of those structures on Earth. Like you can imagine various flying objects and so on. So I just think we have the ability to see that something is richly integrated and structured. Like if there are like lots of parts that fit together and that sort of form in a complex, valuable and intricate way, we can be confident that the parts fit together, and then that would it's sort of like beneficial for there to be a unified explanation of that. But yeah, okay, Tarn. Which bits of the article do you disagree with, or?
Well, I mean, I imagine like most people, I disagree with quite a few parts. But I thought the most interesting disagreement is the way that I think there's a tension between your reliance on simplicity and your dismissal of theodicy, right? Because you're basing this not dismissal of theodicy, your support of theodicies, because you're basing the simplicity prior on the idea that goodness is this really simple thing. But the more complicated you make the concept of goodness, which I think you agree that it's not literally absolutely simple. It's just that it's far simpler than your vast array of mathematical laws. The more complicated you make your concept of goodness in order to allow for theodicy, the weaker your simplicity prior argument gets. Do you agree with that tension?
No. Well, so let me explain, I think, two areas of disagreement. The first one is that I think that it is not that thinking of God as just a perfect being or a maximally good being or something like that is not the only route to establishing that God is simple. So sure. I have an article called 10 Ways God Can Be Simple, where I argue that there are quite a few routes to this. One of them is thinking of God as sort of like an unlimited agent or an unlimited mind or something like that. So there are lots of other routes. So even if I was convinced that, look, this whole goodness thing is very complicated and thinking that that's fundamental to God means that he's fundamental, this would only very slightly decrease the probability of theism. The second point is that I think that when you're looking at the probability, so I think goodness is fundamental. Now, describing all the particular things that are good, that would get complicated. But I think that if goodness is fundamental, then your description of God in the sort of minimal reference length description of God, it can be kind of simple because you can just say God is a being of unlimited goodness. and it's already built into the concept of goodness what the other stuff is. So here's maybe an analogy. Imagine that it's actually very difficult to determine what makes up a possible world. So imagine that the rules for determining whether something is possible are actually sort of complicated. And I think this might be right. I heard it might be that there aren't super simple rules to determine whether something's possible, but you actually need some complicated way of doing it. This wouldn't lower the probability of modal realism, which is the idea that every possible world concretely exists, because modal realism is simply the idea that it says that every possible world concretely exists, but you don't have to build in the description exactly how you define the possible worlds, because the idea is that if there's some concept that's fundamental that doesn't reduce or break down any further, then you get to invoke that as a fundamental entity in your theory that you're using in the description that you're using to describe your theory.
So I agree with the analogy in that I think these two things rise or fall together. But I do think that you need to include an account of the possible in your theory of modal realism. I mean, maybe you're relying on there being sort of like a pointer to possibility rather than a description. But I think if that's the case, you're no longer talking about minimum message length. You're talking about some other account of simplicity.
No, I think you are talking about minimal message length. The question is, what things are you allowed to include in the minimum message, right? So I think that you're allowed to include in the minimum message things that are fundamental, right? So refrigerators aren't fundamental, so you can't just have a single word for refrigerator that's simple to say. But goodness is fundamental, so you can say, look, there's just unlimited goodness, and that's very simple.
Okay,
I think
I see the disagreement now. The disagreement is about the permissibility of this idea of fundamental. For me, a minimum message length, you can choose which things you include and then build other things out of it, but you still have to describe those basic elements. You don't there's no distinct sort of ontological category of things that are fundamental in minimum message length. So that this is
well. So in terms of the minimum message length, you're going to need some language to describe what the thing is, right? You're going to have some language, right? It's going to be a message length in some language, and
so you need to include the sort of complexity of the description of that language inside. This is like the idea of in cosmograph complexity, the idea of the Turing machine that you choose to use to describe, right? Like if you can have arbitrarily complicated Turing machines, but because it's just a concept. In K complexity, we don't care about it. But in minimum message length, as sort of like a philosophical tool, I think it very much does matter, right?
Okay, so let me just be clear on this. Your view is that what we want to look at is the simplicity. It's the simplest thing in the simplest language, or something like that.
Right. And yeah. Or just the simplest language that adequately accounts for everything. But if we're talking about the simplicity of a specific thing like goodness, then yes.
Okay, so I disagree. I think that there's going to be some. It's not just like whatever the simplest language is to describe it. First of all, I think that that'll just push it up a level, because to evaluate the simplicity of a language, you'll need some meta language for determining the simplicity of a language. And then second of all, I think it disagrees with our intuition, which is that like the prior probability of like Tegmark's mathematical realism, I don't think would depend on how complicated it is to describe the mathematical realm. Because my thought is that you take the things that we all accept, or at least we should accept, right? That I think should be part of our background information are the necessary facts like goodness. And then once we have those built in, we want the simplest theory to describe it. And so it's not an extra, like an extra cost if it's a simpler things. I also think that I don't think that simplicity works the same way. I think that simplicity only is a virtue in terms of things that seem like they could be otherwise. So it's like, you shouldn't think that like all else equal, you should think a simpler theory is more likely of the universe, because it seems like, like if one theory says that there are just two universes and the other that there's one, the one that says that there are one, assume they're both fundamental, is better, because that theory better, it seems like this extra thing that could have been otherwise isn't the case. But I think in terms of like fundamental things like morality that don't seem like they could be otherwise, I'm not sure exactly, but I think simplicity is either not a virtue at all or much less of a virtue. And this view is not unique to me. Richard Chappell's also written about it, and I think various other people.
Yeah, I think that that dispute kind of boils down to this question of whether necessary, so you have necessary truths, and I think it's related to the question of whether you accept that there can be brute facts as necessary truths, because I think clearly if you do, those have to be counted in the simplicity, right? But if you think there are, I get free floating necessary truths that like just are true and as like a fundamental quality of I'm trying to guess at Platonism without saying Platonism, I guess, but yeah, so I guess that's a question. Do you think brute facts as necessary truths is kosher?
I think it depends on what we mean by a necessary truth. So I think that it depends on what we mean by brute fact. Where on some accounts of a brute fact, if what you mean by brute fact is just a fact that's not explained by anything deeper, then I think, yes, there are going to be lots of brute facts that are necessary. But if we think of a brute fact as something that sort of like seems like it calls out for further explanation, then I don't think that there are going to be any necessary brute facts that would seem to an ideal agent like they call out for explanation, right? Like if like lots of people, they're like they focus very hard on trying to simplify like the mortal fact. So they want to say like, oh, we want a deeper explanation of why like suffering is bad. And I don't think we need something like that. I just think you can say that suffering is bad just doesn't seem like the type of thing that calls out for an explanation. It's not the type of thing that you can you can wonder why it does, but I don't think it's the type of thing that genuinely demands some deeper answer to that question.
So it seems to me like in that case, you do need to include it in your simplicity account. If it's
so I think you and I we would certainly have some philosophical disagreements about exactly how to calculate simplicity. I think that on the right theory, you don't count the necessary truths that don't seem to call out for deeper explanation. And then I think that you get to reference fundamental entities. And so on that picture of God is very simple. But the broader point is, I think all this stuff is very complicated. It's not exactly clear how to calculate simplicity. So I think in a case like that, where all this is very murky, you should assign a sort of medium prior and then just update on the evidence. Like if you're not sure what the prior is, maybe it's high, maybe it's low, lots of really smart people disagree about it. You shouldn't like dogmatically stick to your guns, say definitely this is low or definitely this is high. You say maybe the optimal theory says it's high, maybe the optimal theory of prior says it's low, but in either case, I'm not certain about that. So I should think sort of some probability of each. Then you get a kind of a prior that's in the middle. And then if it explains the evidence well, then we'll conclude that it's likely. Now, I find the arguments for theism being very simple to be convincing. So I think that theism like all started out with not just a medium prior, but with a pretty high prior.
right.
But
so I think the reason I'm interested in the question is not actually because of calculating simplicity. It's because for me there's a tension between a simpler God and the explanatory power of the God theory, right? I think a lot of the things that you want to say theism explains well are things which like you're implicitly making your concept of God look a lot less basic, less fundamental, and less simple to me intuitively. I bring up goodness and the problem of evil because it seems like the most stark contrast, but I think a lot of the others have this. Again, I don't want to say it's a problem because maybe that all balances out in the appropriate way, but it is a tension which I don't see addressed.
Yeah. So I disagree that it's a tension, because I think that the simplicity that you have, that I agree, like suppose you're a hedonist about well-being. it's going to be hard to get out of the problem of evil. But I think that the extra complexity comes from what you're taking in to be part of the concept of good. And so I don't think that'll add to the complexity of God. It adds to the complexity of goodness.
Right, which is why I think it matters so much that whether or not the concept of God is parasitic on the concept of goodness, whether you have to count the complexity of goodness in with God.
But I think that the complexity of God, that what we care about, in terms of the complexity of God is the extra complexity needed just to describe God itself, rather than to describe like the rest of the non-natural facts. Now, I would.
I agree with you. That's true. If we're assuming that there are non-natural facts,
right? So,
not, right?
Yeah. Well, so I agree that it's going to be hard to have an account if you're like if you're a moral anti-realist or something. It's going to be hard to have an account on which God is simple. I think probably you can have it be a little simple, but you're going to have to add a lot more in. But I think that you should. I mean, first, you shouldn't be a moral anti-realist. And if you are a moral anti-realist, you shouldn't be like certain of it. So you should think, okay, maybe it's false. And then you'll think, okay, like say 20% chance of moral non-naturalism. Okay, 20% chance that God's really simple. And so then it's like, if God's really simple, then your overall prior in God is going to be kind of medium.
Sorry, I was laughing at Roberto's comment.
Yeah. Oh, what's Roberto's comment?
Cooking the books with an objective list. Theory of morality.
That's funny. I mean, yeah, I do think I think that view would just be implausible that this world in particular is on the objective list. But
but
wow,
it would be implausible because of the simplicity issue, right? Because your objective list is just so complicated.
No, I don't think it's implausible because of the simplicity issue. I don't think that simplicity is a virtue in like if something seems like a part of the good upon reflection, you shouldn't think, well, probably it's not part of the good because of simplicity considerations. Now, I think that the reason why having this world in particular be on the objective list, well, first of all, it seems just like something with as specific as this shouldn't be on the objective list. And then also, it just doesn't seem like there's something intrinsically good about this world in particular rather than some other world. Okay, there do seem to be a lot of people. So Tom, maybe we'll
sure.
Conversation later. But yeah, interesting thoughts. Thanks for sharing. Okay. I don't remember the order of people. I'll just talk
it was
to them.
You and then Roberto, then Gabe, I think.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Ewan. And by the way, Ewan is we've talked before. He's really smart. He's like very young, but he's like good at philosophy. It's very impressive. Yeah, imagine a young person being good at philosophy.
Matt, you found a kindred spirit. It seems like.
Yeah, but I think he's even younger than I am, like by several years. And he reads a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks. That's
Hey, how's it going? Wait, and how's your name pronounced?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Ewan. Yeah.
Ewan. Okay, like the United Nations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, actually, I don't know. I have too much to bring up, so I'll just make it quick, and then I'll pass over to Roberto, because I think I more or less agree with a lot of what you say about the simpleness issue. I'm just wondering if, to what extent constraints on priors, assuming you accept that there are constraints on priors, rational constraints on priors, to what extent those are given by naturalness or like fundamentality in something like Ted Sider's sense rather than simplicity. But I just wanted to flag that because I don't think it makes, like, if you're a moral realist, I'm not sure that makes too much of a difference, in terms of like the prior that you give to God. Well, actually, I don't know. You look like you're thinking about it. So
yeah. So
if
I think both naturalness and simplicity are virtues. I think maybe even naturalness is generally more important. If you have two theories that are equally simple, but one's like really ad hoc and gerrymandered, that theory is way worse. Right? So imagine, okay, I think God's really simple. or I won't load the with God. Okay, let's imagine you have two theories. One theory says there's a theory of physics that's simple, except there's just a random patch where the laws don't do, where the particles don't do anything, a random patch of space. And the other theory says that just there are slightly more complicated laws, such that those two worlds are equally simple to describe. Even though I think those two would be equally simple to describe, I think that the theory on which there's not a random patch gets a big advantage over the theory on which there is a random patch.
Yeah, and I'll just say that maybe that goes some way towards addressing Tan's worries if like, you know, just because on a moral realist view, goodness is a really natural property and so on. But anyway, and then the second point is just like if you set aside worries that, you know, like currently most multiverse hypotheses, there's like some degree of fine-tuning going on with I don't know, the initial conditions, or, you know, I'm not super competent on the physics, but anyway, if you set that aside, do you think that like something like multiverse plus observation selection effect, like, you know, that we have to be here to observe and so on, do you think that does a like decently good job of explaining maybe life and at least like a couple other things on your list, so that
so
like a good enough job that, you know, maybe God still comes up with a higher posterior, but not so much that it's like more than half of your credence space?
So I think that the multiverse theory, it doesn't explain some of the things. So it explains, for example, the presence of biological life. It explains you know, if you believe that there's some giant multiverse, then you can explain why there's biological life. I think you most of the things you won't be able to explain. So you won't be able to explain psychophysical harmony or consciousness. You won't be able to explain the presence of laws, because you need laws in order to get a multiverse, and you need stuff to produce the multiverse. You won't explain the existence of stuff or the existence of laws or the fact that they produce anything interesting. You will explain the finely tuned constants. So you won't explain why the laws pair with the stuff that exists. You'll explain some of it. You of course won't explain the anthropic data or moral, mathematical, and modal knowledge, or most of the other stuff. So you'll be able to explain a bit of it, but I don't think you'll explain most of it. And then I think that this explanation just does have a lot of problems. If people are curious to read them, I have an article called something like "The Fine-Tuning Argument Just Works," and in that I give I think 6 objections to the multiverse. So let me see if I can remember them. I think there are like 6 things, each of which kind of goes against the probability somewhat, that together mean that the atheistic multiverse explanation of fine-tuning is pretty bad. The first point is just that an atheistic multiverse, it is the puzzle of fine-tuning. So there's the puzzle bit and explaining constants. But the most important bit of fine-tuning is just explaining this broad conceptual point, which is that interesting stuff happens. And a multiverse just is a way for interesting stuff to happen. A multiverse simply is, you know, a version of, you know, the world on which interesting stuff happens. So it's improbable that the initial laws would produce a multiverse rather than random static. If you wrote a random computer program to have particles bouncing around, it's very unlikely that you would produce a multiverse that varies the things in order to produce life. Second of all, one of the main examples of fine-tuning is in terms of low entropy, that the universe started in a very low entropy state, and this was improbable. The multiverse can't explain that, because we could still have existed in a high entropy state. We would just have been Boltzmann brains. You know, in a high entropy state, everything would be random chaos. So a bunch of brains would briefly randomly fluctuate into existence. Third, even if the multiverse can explain it, it'll still be evidence for theism, because unless you think the probability of a multiverse on atheism is 1, right? So people will often do this thing where they'll say, look, the multiverse can explain the data, but that doesn't mean it's not evidence for theism. Just because you can make up an atheistic explanation doesn't mean it's not evidence for atheism, any more than the fact that a creationist can make up a gerrymandered explanation for any piece of data means that it's not evidence for evolution. Fourth, one thing that people like Robin Collins has argued is that there's not just fine-tuning for life, but fine-tuning for discoverability. So the laws of nature, they fall in this very narrow range that's ideal for us to do science. We could have still been around in a world where we couldn't have done science. And so it's improbable that we would get laws that make us able to do science. Fifth,
seem to make like theism very, very, to me, in order to make these predictions work, it seems that the theistic hypothesis is way more complex than theists would maybe necessarily think, because there's all these different motivations involved that would result in. So, for example, it's conceivable to me that that God wouldn't make it's conceivable to me that God would make a universe that isn't like fine-tuned for discoverability. Like, why not think that like God would instead be more present in a serious way? So it seems like there's a lot of just so stories for some of these things.
Yeah,
Like
so
consciousness. Why would we think God would care about consciousness unless we're it's like I know that some concepts of God, when it comes to God, being conscious or not, if you take a divine kind of simplicity route, God's very, very simple. I don't think it makes much sense as far as motivations are concerned, because I think you need like actual conscious agents making decisions to have desires in order for like God to desire creatures that are kind of like us because in some way they're like him. Like, to me, that's not a very simple hypothesis that's explaining the data.
Yeah, so wait, before I respond to that, just briefly, I'm going to kick someone out of the call just because somebody else wants to join, but I'll add people back if they want to ask another question. So I guess the most recent person to ask a question was Vikram, so I'll remove you, but like when you get when the time rolls around, so you can actually, Vikram, you have your camera on, you provide, good entertainment and good content. So no, I will kick you, even though you're my friend, but I'll add you back later when you have to answer the question. Okay. Sorry. So, yeah. So, I agree that a lot of these things aren't predicted by theism with super high probability, right? So conditionalizing on the other stuff, you might think the odds of fine-tuning for discoverability are like sort of in the middle where like it's not guaranteed. But I think we can state a very simple, well, okay, let me make a few points. The first one is, even if you don't think these are super high probability, they're so low probability on atheism if I'm right about the data. Like, if I'm right that the constants are like in this extremely narrow range that's like 1 part in 1 to the Google that is ideal for scientific discovery, even if you think the odds of that are only like 5% on theism, it's way higher than on atheism. Second of all,
sorry. Well, I guess my core thing is, though, is for a hypothesis, if we're weighing prior probability, right? It also seems to me that the hypotheses maybe where it isn't predicted that our universe is much more probable than any other configuration of a universe, or if you can even call some of them a universe, it just seems to me that those hypotheses are still much more simple than theism. Like, I think we are taking for granted what is being considered a simple hypothesis in theism, in my opinion. It just, I just not quite sure. So like, what, the constants being the way they are, you could say something like, God conceivably would want some sort of universe in which conscious moral agents can interact with one another in a way that's meaningful. So you need some sort of laws. And so conditional on theism, it's, far more probable, that our universe exists than on some sort of, because we can go with very specific atheistic hypotheses that are much more specific in what they predict, that could explain some of this data. And it would, of course, be more complex of a hypothesis. But I guess my point is, I don't see how that's much more improbable of a hypothesis than theism is. So I'm not seeing. I will grant that theism has a lot of predictive power. I just am definitely very shaky on the idea that it's simple in order to have that predictive power.
This is kind of the expansion of the argument I was making, by the way. I don't know if I made that clear, but this is where I would have gone with it.
But is so is the problem with simplicity here just that, like, you don't if you want to cram too much into the divine psychology, like, we have to make all kinds of hypotheses of what God might want or not want to do, then the hypothesis becomes really complex? Or is there like a different worry here?
I would say it's a different worry, but it is related. So that's more critiquing how predictive theism is. So I'm arguing that theism is more complex, but you could also say, in addition to that, it also seems that maybe theism isn't quite as predictive as we think, and that is relevant when considering how simple a theistic hypothesis is to competing atheistic hypotheses.
Okay, so here's, I think, the way you should think about simplicity. You should think of it as simplicity has to do with the like fundamental stuff, and then you look at the probability of the other stuff conditional on the fundamental stuff. So theism says there's just one fundamental thing, namely God. unlimited, goodness, perfection. Okay. And then you look at, okay, what's the probability of all the other stuff conditional on God? Well, so the probability is pretty high, I think. Like for most of now, in contrast on atheism, what you say is that the things that are fundamental are certain laws that produce something interesting. Every step of that is, and physical stuff, every step of that is improbable. First, for that, there has to be physical stuff. Next, there have to be laws. Next, the laws have to apply to the physical stuff that exists. Next, they have to produce anything interesting. All four of those are extremely unlikely. And so
there's non-natural atheistic hypotheses as well, right? So we don't even have to posit physical. We don't have to have physical posits for atheists to make this point, no?
Right. Well, right. So I was in particular addressing naturalism. Now there are going to be other atheistic hypotheses, and we can discuss those, but I don't think those are generally very plausible. And most of those that the ones that explain the data do, I think, generally point to theism, like axiarchism. Yeah. So once we have, the theist says, here's the foundation, God. The atheist says, here's the foundation, this physical stuff. Well, then I think that in order to explain the relevant data, the theist will just have to build into their theory the atheist, just so many different extremely improbable things. Like they'll have to take as fundamental, physical stuff exists, laws, the four things I discussed. Then there are psychophysical laws. The psychophysical laws are harmonious. The psychophysical laws produce the universe produces things that are conscious in combination with the psychophysical laws. We have minds that are able to grasp the non-natural facts. All of these are extremely improbable. And so on theism, the probability of all these things happening, just being built into the fundamental laws, is very, very, very low. In contrast, theism has this very simple account of what's fundamental, and then this fundamental thing predicts with much higher probability all these things. So it's not clear exactly what the odds of a physical universe on theism are, but like maybe not that low. So, maybe like 1% or something, similar to atheism. Like, I don't know, hard to do. And then once you have a physical universe, the other stuff comes for free because God has no use making just a limp, lifeless, valueless physical universe. He wants to make a physical universe that does stuff. So he would make laws and conscious agents and so on and so forth. So right, for that reason, yeah.
I'm not, so you mentioned a popular idea, I think, that started making rounds on the internet from Josh Rasmussen back in the day. That's the idea of perfect goodness or unlimited goodness, right? And that's kind of where this idea of theism as a simple theory, I think some of it is being motivated by, unless I'm mistaken in that. Just the idea of we can really posit like this one thing and we can say it's unlimited or it's perfect. And so really we're just kind of positing there's one fundamental posit in that sense. And from there it entails these different things, omnipotence, omniscience, and so on and so forth. And you don't find that move dubious at all? It seems to me that this idea of so the way that I would kind of describe it is, it seems to me you kind of have one of two dilemmas that I would say that theists would need to face, which is, it seems like that this idea of perfect goodness, it either like isn't that simple, where you have to be specific about what values this theistic being has, or it's just so underpredicted on theism, like what in fact would it seems we have to have very specific views on divine psychology, what God would do, would not do.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many other ideas of, like, say, a brain or a mind that is limited or that doesn't have those complex thoughts and interactions. There's so many different possibilities that I just don't understand why we are jumping to, no, the best explanation is it's omnipotent, it's omniscient, and it's omnibenevolent. I'm just going
to
Sorry, my bad.
Address that briefly, but I know Eugene has to go soon, so after this, I'll let him talk, because I specifically offered, like, he was leaving a comment, and so I offered to go. But before that, let me just address what you said very briefly. I don't find there to be anything dubious about the move. I think that you can get the other stuff out of the concept of goodness. And I think that believing that there's this concept of goodness should be part of our background information. We should already think there's good things. So then once you think that and I don't think it's a cost to a theory that it says that the abstract objects are complicated for reasons that I was explaining earlier. And so once you think that the concept of goodness, that goodness and value are a real thing, then you can just say, look, with this being with the single thing of unlimited goodness, it's very simple and it explains all the stuff, which is a good theory. Okay, Eugene and Gabe, happy to go back to you after Eugene leaves. But yeah, I wanted to get a chance to discuss Eugene's objections. So Eugene Earnshaw. So where nice to meet you. We were exchanging some messages. So where do you think the sort of argument goes wrong?
Well, I mean, I think I can kind of continue on from what Gabe was discussing, right? But make more the meta point, right? Which is that all of these claims that are being made, right? Like about whether or not God is simple, about whether simpleness is grounds for being good explanatorily, about what exactly God does explain, about what the alternative explanations are, right? Like all of these things are being made in a context where there's no standards by which we can judge their plausibility, right? Like this was in the comments, we eventually got to talking about a few different like scenarios, right? We were talking about Caesar, then we were talking about dark matter, and then we're talking about God, right? And I see this whole sort of like set of arguments, right, as very much in the vein of all of the kind of old hyper rationalists, right, like Leibniz and Malebranche, right, who are like trying to start from first principles, and like you've got these theorems, and then you're just like, deductive proof, right? And the response that those guys got back like 400 years ago is that like all of these inferences, right, because they're not based on anything that we are in contact with and that we've experienced predicting, and that is like empirical basically, right? They are ultimately they're I mean, they would have said mere intuitions. I'll say vibes, right? Like it's just like what's the probability that a divine intelligence is going to create something simple? How could we even decide that, right? Like how can we decide how much more probable simplicity makes something than something that's a bit less simple, right? I mean, we can't even agree on whether or not God is simple, right? Because you think that the arguments in favor of that are convincing, right? But there's plenty who don't, right? And they've got good arguments in favor, right? So I mean, I'm not saying that some of these topics can't be adjudicated to some degree, right? But like for most of the kinds of considerations that are being brought up by these arguments, right? There's no basis for having an opinion about how probable it is, right? And so what we should be saying is we don't know, right? We can't evaluate that, right? And if we can't evaluate that, we certainly can't say that it's convincing, right? I'll just stop there so you can get in.
Yeah, so I agree that it's hard to assign very precise probabilities to these things. Well, okay, first of all, I disagree with the idea that my arguments are sort of similar to Leibniz and coming up with deductive proofs of things. I actually think they're sort of the opposite, where I don't like the deductive proofs. I think that what the thing that should lead us to thinking there's a God is that God is the best explanation of lots of things that we see, not that like there are certain logical arguments that nail down with absolute certainty that God exists, that from the existence of change, you can conclude that there's a purely actual actualizer to actualize, etc. Then you said you think we can't decide the probabilities. And I agree that deciding the probabilities is going to be a little bit hand-wavy and it's going to be hard to do. But I think this is true of any time you infer any agent did anything on any grounds. So let me give two examples. Suppose that we discovered that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God. Do you agree that that would be strong evidence for the existence of God?
Sorry, excuse me.
No worries. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Now you could make the same point there, where you could say, look, we don't know the probabilities. It's all very mysterious. We don't know the probability that God would do that. But nonetheless, even though we don't know the probability is so low on the alternative theory, and we don't know the exact probabilities, but it's like we can just see intuitively that it's way higher. And if you don't think we can do that, you should not trust any Ancient probabilities, right? So we have two theories. Okay, theory one is that I wrote the article about the existence of God that I wrote, and theory two is that I commissioned a leprechaun to do it, or got my uncle to do it, or something, to write the article. You could say, look, we have no idea the probabilities. It's all very confusing. What's the odds that I would write that particular article? We don't know. Like it requires coming to assessments about the odds that a person would write a very, it's a bunch of different articles. The probability that I would write the article is super low, given how long the article is and how specific each word is. And it's true, but even if the probabilities are a little bit hand wavy and they're not super precise, that doesn't mean you can't be confident in your judgment. And if it did, it would mean we can't be confident anytime we think any agent did anything for any reason.
So I think it's very important to distinguish, right, between the different kinds of grounds that we're talking about here, right? I mean, inference in general is a lot harder than people often think, right? But I'm absolutely with you that, broadly speaking, we can, justify the sorts of inferences that we make about Julius Caesar, about you being the author of that kind of thing, right? But the reason is that those are much more embedded in things that we have very good evidence for and we understand very, very well, right? We understand people very well. We understand the causes around the production of textual documents, right? Like these are all very, very different in terms of their epistemic status than talking about, what a supreme being does, right? Like there are certain things that, okay, fine. You can say that if a supreme being is perfectly good, then that's incompatible with certain things, right? So there's like a few logical deductions that you can make, right? But even then, right, like the problem of evil, people can't agree on what exactly God's goodness rules out, right? I mean, there's a huge debate on it, right? And lots of, I assume you, right? People think that although it might appear to be contradictory that there is good in the world, but evil in the world, but a perfectly good God. Actually, when you get down into it, you'll see that blah blah blah. It's a lot more complex, right? The point is that like the sorts of questions, right, and the sorts of evidence that you're trying to use to establish this thing, it's just it is of the nature that our degree of even ability to assign probabilities to it is very, very, very different than the kind of thing where you're talking about like, oh, was it a raccoon that tore up my garbage, or were you the author of that paper, right? And like the reason why I'm sort of aligning, I mean, I think if you look at Leibniz and Spinoza and how they start to make their justifications, I don't think that the contrast is that big necessarily, but in any case, right, the similarity that I see is that the response to these guys, right, and you find it in Kant, you find it in the Vienna Circle, you find it all over the place, right, is basically people saying over and over again, like, whoa, slow your roll, right? Like, how do you know that stuff, right? Like, it seems obvious to you that this inference follows, right? But this kind of inference, these very metaphysical, right? These very divorced from empirical experience, these very hypothetical, these topics where we aren't even sure whether causation applies, right? Where we can't even necessarily agree whether explanations are possible or warranted, right? Like, does the beginning of the universe warrant explanation? I mean, I know you have an argument that says yes, but I have an argument that says no, right? And how do we like, I am very, very dubious that there are any grounds that can command rational assent, right? That we can get within, orders of magnitude of a assignment of probability here, right? Like,
what you're saying is, I think, just a fully general counterargument to any evidence ever adduced for the existence of God. No matter what you say, you can always say, well, we don't really know the probabilities, so we can.
No, if God, if you believe, say, that the evidence for the resurrection is good, that's eyewitness evidence, right? If
that's eyewitness evidence he rose from the dead. What are the odds that God would raise him from the dead rather than some other spirit or something else?
I'm not saying that it's nothing that somebody could reject, right? But that kind of evidence is very different from the kind of very metaphysical, very hypothetical and extremely difficult to quantify kinds of
The
problems that we're
resurrection
talking about
evidence
here,
is
right?
also extremely hard to quantify. I mean, let's say you think that,
Yeah, but it's
what,
empirical, right?
well, the evidence that I am pointing to is also empirical. Most of it. It points to facts about the world that are not denied, like the fact that the world has laws, like the fact that the world has finely tuned constants, like the fact that you exist, and then it looks at the probability of those on different hypotheses, like the fact that there's consciousness.
Well, yeah, but key steps in all of these involve these metaphysical assumptions, right? About
I don't think
simplicity,
they
about what
involve.
God is going to will, right? Like all.
But any argument of any kind where you argue that God exists on the basis of certain evidence is going to rely on some assumption about what God wills, right? If you thought that there was a 0% chance that God would will Christ raised from the dead, then the evidence for him wouldn't be any evidence for that. Then the evidence for the resurrection wouldn't be any evidence for the existence of God. Anytime you use God to explain any fact about the world, you're going to have to make assumptions about the existence of God. If the sky spelled out made by God, you could say, well, what are the odds that God would make it? You could spell out a bunch of different things. It's totally unclear what the probabilities are, and it's true. The probabilities are going to be kind of hand wavy, but you can be very confident on the basis of lots of very hand wavy probabilities, like in the case where it spells out made by God, like in the normal cases where we infer things about agents, even agents that are mysterious to us.
It's pretty clear, right, that there are lots of religious predictions, right, that are quite specific, right? So, I mean, I think in the discussions, right, what came up was the idea that various religions have predicted apocalypse at various times, right, and gotten it wrong, right? That's a very positive prediction, right? And yeah, of course, you can argue about like to what extent does the failure of apocalypse deprobabilify the religion and things like that, right? But the point that I'm making, right, is it is a matter of degrees, okay? There are always, yes, ways of avoiding conclusions, right? And I mean, this is one of the problems in scientific inference, right? Like, there's not a hard and fast rule for like when you abandon the old theory based on the accumulating evidence, right? But it's like, it's clear that there's certain types of topics, right, where it is much, much harder to gain assent, where it is much, much harder to evaluate what the range of probabilities is, right, where it is much, much harder to see even what the relevant evidence could be, right? So, I mean, if we talk about, to what extent does the evidence around the resurrection probabilify Christianity, right? Like, that is much more like the question of, did a raccoon get into my garbage, right? It is much more connected with, what does this text say? How much credence should we put in eyewitness testimony? How much credence, like, it is much more grounded. And yeah, I mean, it's not like there's a sharp dividing line where, like, I mean, for some philosophers there is, right? But I'm not saying there necessarily is, right? But like, for like pretty much all of the discussion that has happened on this, in this nice little meeting up until this point, right? Like, my background question is like, how could you possibly decide, right? Like, there's just so little purchase for, you're just working with intuitions about like, what does simplicity really mean? And I mean, it's very different if like scripture says that God has such and such attributes. That is something that you can argue on in a much more direct plane if that connects with empirical reality, right? But if you're talking about the origins of the universe and these topics that we can observe very indirectly, if at all, right? And then talking about like the odds of like laws where we have no idea, like even like what sort of possible mechanisms can create universes, and like all of this is completely beyond our experience, right? We just have nothing to guide our intuitions about the probabilities here. So it's just like it's on the very far end of how much confidence we can put in any of these kind of arguments.
I completely disagree that it's like very far beyond our experience. I mean, here's what you need to make the predictions. All the evidence that I give. Okay, you need basically three things. You need the idea that God would want to make physically instantiated agents in a universe. He would want them to be able to explain to understand the broad features of the universe. And you'd need the idea that he would want to create all possible agents. Now, that last one I think comes for free because it just follows from the assumption that God is good plus standard assumptions in population ethics. And that's only needed for the last argument. So if you're doubtful of that, then all the rest of the case works. So what this means is that you just need like two assumptions on theism, neither of which are, maybe they're not that likely, but they're not that unlikely. It's not so obvious what the odds are that conditional on theism, you'd get sort of like, agents that are physically instantiated, but like it's not that low, right?
Well, if I could just interrupt, because I actually have to go in like 2 minutes. Like, what I'm saying is that no, you have no grounds for making any statement about what the odds are that God is going to create physical agent, right? There's no possible evidence that I can see that you could commend assent with about
you have grounds
where to put that. Like, is it 0.infinity%? Is it 1? Is it somewhere in between?
Eugene, you're repeating this point about how it's very hand wavy and we don't have precise probabilities, right?
But the degree of the hand waviness matters, right?
My point is that there are lots of things that are hand wavy. Any argument for God is going to be hand wavy in this way. Where any argument for God that is evidential, you're going to have to be thinking about the probability is that God would do it. But you can say, look, it's very hand wavy. What are the odds that God would make a sign in the sky that says the world was made by God, or in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God? That's just as hand wavy. It's just as hand wavy in that it's making, like, saying maybe God would do X. But nonetheless, even though it is hand wavy, it's like there are lots in the real world. Almost every probability is hand wavy. Almost every probability is very hand wavy. You can't even give to within 10 orders of magnitude the odds that I would write the exact article that I wrote. But nonetheless, you can be confident that I wrote it, because even though your probabilities are very hand wavy, even though it's not at all clear what the probabilities are, you can be confident that the probabilities are way better of that than of the alternative theory, which is that a ghost or a leprechaun wrote it.
I think that's the difference between the God writes in the sky example, though. That
could
all
I
of the
just
alternatives
say that I have to go, and thanks very much for talking
to me briefly. For chatting. This was interesting.
Okay.
Yeah,
take care, Eugene.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good one.
So the example of God writing in the
Wait,
sky.
Sorry to cut you off just very briefly. For other people who are in the waiting room, I can't like bring everyone in, but just know if you're in the waiting room, I'll let you in eventually. So don't leave or like, yeah. Anyways.
So I think the point you make about lots of probabilities being hand waving is, I think, importantly misleading, because very, very small probabilities often aren't hand wavy. And I think we can very confidently say that alternative explanations for the God, whatever the exact sentence you said being written in the sky, is infinitesimal. I mean, not literally, obviously, but it's incredibly, incredibly small. So we can say that the odds ratio between that and, God is real and did that because he wanted to say hi is very high. And I think the difference between lots of the examples that you're adducing from is that we can't, or if we can, you need to make the argument that the alternative probabilities are like unhand-wavingly small, rather than making the positive argument that the God probabilities are hand-wavingingly.
Well, so I can walk through the case. So the idea is, okay, so what's the probability that there would be physical stuff on theism versus atheism? That I don't know. That one I agree. It's hand wavy. It's hard to know the probabilities. I think this one's maybe a wash, where in both cases the probabilities are very low, because it's like it's not super obvious. Like the simplest theory is that there would just be nothing on atheism, and on theism, you don't have a reason to expect there to be physical stuff, when it seems like maybe like just a disembodied mind paradise would seem to be the most likely option. So in both cases, it's kind of low, not clear exactly what the probabilities are. And maybe you say this is good evidence for naturalism, right? Because you think the probability is really low. Maybe it's 1,000 to 1 evidence for naturalism. But then after you have that, all the other stuff just becomes quite straightforwardly evidence for theism. Because once you have physical stuff, God doesn't just want physical particles that sit around totally impotent, doing nothing of interest or value. He only wants to create physical stuff if it's going to do stuff. So that predicts that he would make laws. It predicts the laws would apply to the stuff that exists. It produces that they would produce interesting structures. It produces that there would be finely tuned constants. It predicts that conscious creatures would come to exist. It predicts that those creatures would be in a world of psychophysical harmony. Now, I agree. It doesn't predict that our lives would be as shitty as they are, right? So evil's massive evidence against theism. It's strong evidence in the other direction. And it doesn't predict divine hiddenness. So I agree. That's also strong evidence in the other direction. And then, it also predicts with, now some of the stuff, it predicts it with maybe a little bit less great probability. So maybe it's not guaranteed that God would like have religious experiences or something like that. But we can, but all the other stuff that's hand wavy, we can explain it with one further stipulation, which is that he wants to put us in a world where we are the types of creatures that are capable of understanding each of the broad contours of the world. So we're able to get at basic moral truths, basic modal truths, basic theological truths. And once we have that assumption, then we're able to explain all the data very eloquently. Not eloquently, sorry, elegantly. And then, so then we should just go with that theory because it explains everything so well, that God wants to put us in a broadly indifferent, God exists and wants to put us in a broadly indifferent universe where we're able to learn the broad contours of the world. That theory predicts everything in our experience. There's no piece of data that favors naturalism over that theory. And while it has a low prior on account of like it being unlikely that God would want to put us in an indifferent universe, it explains everything so well that even if the prior is like 1 in a million or something, the fact that it is supported by literally all the evidence and by like 24 pieces of evidence gives us very good reason to accept it.
But when we're talking about specific atheistic hypotheses, right? It might be a different story, especially given and you did sum it up, I think, the theistic case quite well. But one of the first responses I think that will generally come to mind for an atheist would be, well, what about evil? And I think that, so like, you could literally posit like a non-natural, I think, because if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to mischaracterize your views, but I know you're very sympathetic to consequentialism and these ideas. So basically the idea of like the ideas that God, for example, might be entailed that God would create more worlds than just ours, for example, because he's trying to maximize, something. So the idea is that, and yet to me, that's very similar to something like a multiverse, or that's something that's very similar to just some non-natural entity that is perfectly good and is just creating every good state of affairs randomly or something like that. Like that to me seems as simple. And I think it better explains evil, because I think on the unlimited goodness hypothesis, first of all, it doesn't follow to me that unlimited goodness would include being an agent. Like I could totally conceive of unlimited goodness as some sort of abstract, a causal force or something like that. So I think you really do need to get the idea of like perfect being or perfect agent, or an agent in limited in goodness or something like that. But so I just don't see then how theism is all that for all the predictive power that theism has, that it's so much more, that it's on par and when it comes to simplicity with, like, say, that naturalistic universe generator creating every good possible state of affairs. Like I just don't see what the appeal to theism is, even compared to something that simple.
Yeah, so I agree with you that evil is very strong evidence against the existence of God, and that especially many specific features of evil. Now, I think we can give an explanation of that by adding into the theistic hypothesis that God wants to play to us in a broadly indifferent universe. So he wants to have a universe that has the broad structural features of a different universe. And I've written a long piece about this that people can read. If you go to my blog and type in why there's evil, you can find it. But the basic idea is that having a world that looks like a godless world is valuable, and that it allows us to help each other out, to strengthen our relationship with God by seeing sort of what a godless world would be like. And it allows us to, and then there might be all sorts of unknown goods. It might be ideal for soul building, where it's like, it's especially good for the quality of our soul if God doesn't bail us out. You don't have to think this is that probable, but it's like odds better than like 1 in a million, I think. So I think then we have this option. And then once we have this, and we have the idea that he'd want to put us in a world like this and make it, and I think this is not totally unmotivated, like we can give reasons for it, in a world that's like this, where we're able to understand the broad contours of the world, both moral, theological, mathematical, modal, then we explain all the data, and there's no evidence that favors atheism over that more specific theistic hypothesis. Now, of course, you can compare it to a more specific atheistic hypothesis. So you can build into your atheistic hypothesis very specific things about the laws. And then my claim is just that the theistic hypothesis is way more plausible. That the theistic hypothesis, it doesn't have to posit, the atheistic hypothesis, I think, will have to posit as brute the following facts. physical stuff exists. There are laws. The laws apply to the stuff that exists. Each of these are very improbable, I think. And I'm happy to go into why each of them are very improbable. The laws produce something interesting. There are finely tuned constants. There are every
would
possible...
That be brute on atheism? On specific atheists. Why would that be brute on specific atheistic hypotheses? Because usually they're oftentimes they're put forth as necessary beings. And so I don't see how something would be brute on that view.
Oh, well, I think something can be brute and also be necessary. When I was saying it was brute, it's sort of like it's unexplained, right? So if you just say like the universe is necessary and you don't have a deeper explanation of why the universe is necessary, then that would be brute in exactly that way. It's not like if I get a bunch of royal flushes in poker, it's not a good theory to say, well, maybe it's just brute that it's necessary that I get the royal flushes in poker. Now I want to address, and there are a bunch more points to raise. I won't walk through the entire thing, but there are like 18 or something things like that, each of which are very improbable. And so I think the atheistic theory starts to look very, very bad, where it's like the theistic theory has to posit like 3 or 4 things, and some of them are unlikely, but some of them are really likely, while the atheistic theory has to posit like 18 things, and they're all very unlikely. Now, you raised...
I'm not sure if I agree, though. I'm sorry. I've been talking too much. My bad.
No worries. Let me just address the point very briefly that you made about that you have to build in that it's an agent. I don't think that's true for 2 reasons. First of all, if you say that there's some maximal goodness force, then that maximal goodness force would result in God existing because it's good when God exists. And second of all, I think that a single thing of unlimited goodness would necessarily be an agent, because it's better if it is an agent and is infinitely well off than if it's just sort of a force that does good things. It's better for a being to be well off than for a force to just create a good stuff, given that they'd both create the same amount of good stuff, but one of them would also have there be a being that is.
But why wouldn't it just be like something abstract rather than something that's a force or anything like that? That's, I guess, maybe what I'm understanding. Like, I think we are taking something that's a modifier, something that describes a being, an entity, or something like that, and we're trying to make that an entity in and of itself. And I think in and of itself, it doesn't make much sense unless you kind of smuggle in this idea of being. You know, like it's a being that's unlimited in goodness or something like that. And I'm speaking of being broadly. I'm not trying to say
it's just if you have a single thing of unlimited goodness, then that's God. And this is not the only way to get it. You can also, I think God is just an unlimited agent or an unlimited mind or an omnipotence trope, as people like Joshua Sijuwade argue. I think it's changed the formulation to be like a maximal power trope or something, but something like this. I think there are lots of different routes towards God being simple. But yeah, if you just think of what the best thing is, I think the best possible thing is God, given that he's both infinitely well off and then does the best sorts of things.
Okay, but what if... Oh, sorry, Dave. You wanted to say something?
Oh no, I need to keep up my personal barometer of how long I talk. So go ahead, Roberto. Go for it.
Yeah, but when you say, okay, unlimited goodness is first fundamental and it entails that is God, like, surely you can see that is very controversial for a variety of people. Like, say, take for example I think that for a hedonist, it's easy to say that goodness is fundamental because it's actually only one thing that you have: pleasure, and that's it. But when you have another objects of goodness, another intrinsic goods in your list, those are going to be irreducible, right? And the claim that, oh, it's all just goodness is not going to fly because you have a variety of things that are irreducible. But you're claiming that there's this single fundamental thing.
Well, the idea is that goodness is fundamental, and then there are different examples of things that are good, but it's just that there are lots of different things, like there are lots of different conscious experiences, but you might think conscious experience is fundamental, and then a single being of sort of unlimited consciousness, that would be simple, just like a similar thing of unlimited goodness would be simple.
Okay, that's okay. That's
but like, so I think maybe I can jump in, and Roberto, correct me if I'm wrong. So is the idea kind of like, so we're talking about unlimited goodness, but like if I was going to maybe try to spell out like what is unlimited goodness, one way I could cash that out would be, it is the list of all possible good things, or all good, something along those lines. And arguably, there's actually an infinite number of those things. And it's not clear unless you put something like a being that's unlimited in this or something, how you get a simple fundamental thing, because it doesn't seem like there's this one fundamental thing called goodness. You're positing is the fundamental goodness. No, you're positing the sum total of all possible good things as the foundation. And it seems that's actually really, really important for predicting the things that you need to predict. And just saying goodness itself entails, like, I don't know, like, it's, I guess you at least have goodness and then you have unlimited. And I don't think that's one real thing. I think it's the unlimited means you're just putting every possible good thing into the foundation. Is that a fair way of putting it, Roberto? Or do you think that that's, I'm just way off here?
No, yeah. Basically, my worry is something more like how simple is this fundamental thing? Like, when we're claiming that goodness is fundamental, are we claiming that all of the elements on the objective list are fundamental? And is it at all problematic that we have a lot of elements in our objective list when we claim that goodness is fundamental?
Yeah, so, okay, I think that, well, let me first address Gabe's point, and then I'll address your point, Roberto. So I think, so you could have it be that just every good thing exists. Several problems with that. First of all, that's consistent with theism, right? If every good thing exists, God is a good thing, so God would exist. Second of all, you can't actually have every good thing exist because there are inconsistent good things. So it's good for me to be in Florida, it's good for me to be in Arizona, but I can't be in both.
By good thing, I meant moral truths. I'm sorry if I was very unclear about that. That's what I meant by good things. So not like literally every good thing, but more like every moral truth, every moral true fact.
Like, one way to describe goodness is to describe all of the things which could hypothetically be good. This is the most complicated possible way to describe goodness, right? There are simpler ways to describe goodness by giving, like, conditions, maybe. Your claim, I think, is that you don't need to do any of that descriptive work. Is that right?
Wait, I was going to say that. I was going to address that point, but that was in response to Roberto's point. But first I want to address Gabe's point. So I think that, so you're saying all the moral facts exist. Well, moral facts are abstract objects. Like, how can the fact that pain is bad exist? That doesn't make sense.
So are you invoking then a concept of goodness that goes beyond moral goodness? Because I think that's a very fair question to ask.
When I talk about goodness, what I mean is synonymous with, like, value. It's the sorts of thing that's fortunate.
So it's a form of value realism.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea is just there's a single thing of unlimited goodness or unlimited value or unlimited. It's sort of like, of all the things that could exist, whichever one is the most fortunate to exist, that's the most good thing. Okay, now, Roberto, in terms of your objection, so your worry is that it's sort of like, a lot of pictures, you think, like, goodness is going to be complicated. I think it might be that the abstract object is I was talking about this a little bit with, I think, Tarn before, maybe someone else, I don't remember. And I think it could be that goodness is very complicated, but to describe, but that as long as it's a fundamental thing, you still get to invoke it as a basic element in your theory, right? So it may be that to list, so like imagine if moral particularism were true. It may be that to list all the facts about what's good, you need an infinitely long list. There's no algorithm for describing all the good things, but nonetheless, even though moral particularism is infinitely complicated, you might think it doesn't actually get a prior of zero, because this isn't the right way to think about these things. Maybe it does, but it's not obvious that it does, because the description length, like, simplicity isn't the same sort of virtue when it comes to the abstract object. It may be very difficult to describe all the mathematical facts, but, like, that shouldn't matter. And so that's a view I'm inclined to. And then I also think if you're already convinced of objective list theory, which I think you have reason to accept, then once we're already objective list theorists, we get to invoke as fundamental the goodness facts. And then we get to have those feature in our theories of what the simple thing is, where we just say the simple thing is a thing of unlimited goodness, unlimited value. And so it doesn't matter how complex it is to describe the facts about what's complicated. And the last point is just what I was describing earlier, which is that maybe you think this is right, and that, look, this whole goodness thing is very complicated, it's a mess, and that God isn't simple on account of being unlimited goodness. But there are lots of other routes towards establishing that God is simple, like thinking of God as an unlimited mind or something like that.
Okay, but do you extend? I think you also use this example of arbitrary limits to say that God has a high prior, right? Because God doesn't have any arbitrary limits. I have that right?
Wait, sorry, I was distracted for a moment. Repeat what you said.
Yeah, that's okay. That you think that the fact that God lacks arbitrary limits is a virtue that increases its prior probability.
Yeah.
Okay, but do you extend this logic to your view of welfare? Like, how many objects, intrinsic goods, do you have on your objective list?
No, because I think that, first of all, I think it may actually, I don't know exactly how simple it would be described, but I am sympathetic to views on which the objective list is kind of short, where maybe the goods are just like pleasure and relationships, maybe just those two, maybe also knowledge or something, or achievements. But
Okay,
like, I don't think.
Why 3? Why 4? Why not infinite?
Well, because I think there are arguments against expanding the list to other things. Like I think it's hard to think. I had an article a while back about this, about an objection, the Joan of Arc challenge to knowledge being on the objective list. I think there are certain considerations that favor a small objective list. But anyways, the point is, I also think maybe that objective list is infinite. I don't know. It's kind of hard to know exactly how many things are on the objective list. But I don't think it applies the same way, because, well, maybe it would. Yeah. So I guess I think that in terms of your priors, in terms of the number of things on the objective list, you should have a bias against arbitrary limits, but it's not the sole thing, right? So I think you should think like decent odds. There's just one thing in terms of priors, decent odds, before you consider whether or not specific things are on the objective list. Decent odds, there would be 2 things. Decent odds 3. Decent odds unlimited. But you should think the theory that there are unlimited things on the objective list is better than the theory that there are like exactly like 685 things on the objective list.
Yeah, but
so yeah, I do think there
will claim that. But I've heard you claim, and I find this plausible, that to claim that there's an infinite amount of stuff and to claim that there is only one stuff is sort of symmetrical. Any finite value between those two is going to be arbitrary. Okay, so let's go with that. So then hedonism is going to have a much higher prior than this objective list axiology that is doing a lot of the work for at least some case for theism having a higher prior.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, that might be right. I mean, I don't think it's like 1 and infinity are the numbers that get almost all the prior space, and then the others are what. I think it's like you have a bias towards infinity, and you have it's a bit like the Trinity. I've joked about this, where it's like, of the number of persons in the Godhead, like the best number is 1, and the next best number is infinity. But so it's like you have some bias in favor of those numbers, and then you also have some bias. It's like 2 or 3 is also kind of plausible, but like the bigger the number gets, the less plausible it is. But then infinity is plausible because it lacks arbitrary limits. So yeah, maybe this motivates thinking that the objective list is infinitely complicated. I don't think it'll give hedonism that big of a boost over like objective list theory. And then I also think even if it gives it some of a boost, there are reasons to think hedonism's false. And I think that it's less of a boost where I think that parsimony and these sorts of considerations are much less important with abstract objects. So I think if it seems that something is the case morally, you shouldn't think it's probably not the case morally just on parsimony grounds. I think that parsimony applies to the things that seem to call out for explanation. And maybe you can have some intuitions about the structure of the abstract realm, but those should be way more tentative than the other sorts of intuitions. Like you have much stronger motivation for thinking that space is endless than for thinking that the number of moral facts is endless or is either 0 or endless. then for thinking the number of moral facts is 0.
It is kind of convenient that the usual saying is 0, 1, and infinity, and then you've sort of left out 0. Because the saying, the only numbers that require no justification is 0, 1, and infinity, which is kind of where I don't have.
Oh, 0, like 0 gods. Are you talking about that term?
0 gods, 0 moral facts, 0 things on your objective list. Like the ruling out of 0 is convenient. I don't necessarily know that that's a very serious critique. It was amusing.
Matthew, do you mind if I just bring up one objection to theism, and then I gotta get out of here. Actually, and I can leave open some room for people who are waiting, I guess.
No, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, there are more people in the waiting room.
So,
yeah, but
one thing I think that we also need to keep in mind is, and I think you're acutely aware of this, that atheism doesn't just mean it just is like the rejection of God. But like technically, if you believed in a being that was, say, all good,
atheism is just a lack of belief.
Not going to even go there. But say you believe in a being that was, say, all good, all powerful, but was only like really smart, but like wasn't omniscient, right? That to me wouldn't fit the definition of God. Like it would be interesting if such a being existed, but I'm using the classical definition when I refer to God here. So I guess my question is, I think it's really important that you mentioned that this idea of like unlimited goodness or being that's that's perfectly good or something like that, that we are referring to like some sort of value realism. And I want to make my case against that real fast, I guess, if I would, which is, I want to question, like, how strong is the intuition to you that not just that there are these stance-dependent facts about value, other than I find this valuable, and we can articulate quite well reasons why we find different things valuable, right? And for me, it's very hard to take that and to say, to say what is entailed by this idea of like perfect goodness or something like that, because it isn't clear to me. For example, like, is it perfectly sharp? Like, apart from my desires, which I am like, inquiring about, I don't see any reason to see why like something that is perfect in goodness wouldn't include a whole bunch of things that I don't value and would reject a bunch of things that I do value. It just seems very weird for me to jump from I valued this to these are an objective set of values, or value realism is true in some metaphysically weighty sense.
Yeah, so Michael Huemer has a good book called Ethical Intuitionism that makes the case for moral realism. More importantly, I have a good blog post called Moral Realism is True, where I make the case for it. Though I wrote it a long time ago. I don't think it was great, but it was okay. I do think moral realism is very plausibly true. And the reason to think that is it's not. So I think if something seems to be the case to you, you have a reason for thinking that it's the case, unless you have a really strong reason to doubt it. Right? So it seems there's an external world. I should think there's an external world unless I have a reason to doubt it. It seems like in non-curved space, the shortest distance between 2 points is a line. So I should think that unless I'm given a strong reason to doubt it. Seems
so
like
is your intuition that strong that perfect value exists, like in some sort of
that what exists?
Notion? That like perfect value, maybe in a sense.
What do you mean by perfect value?
Unlimited.
Well, I don't have the intuition that whether unlimited value exists, that'll just depend on whether we think God exists. The idea is that God value exists, and it seems like it's like possibly unlimited. You could have a being of unlimited value. So I think that.
But I thought, sorry, because I asked those questions earlier because you kept talking about unlimited goodness. And I asked, are we just talking about moral goodness, or are we talking about other stuff besides moral goodness? Right.
I was using goodness and value as synonymous, and I think we would be talking about.
Okay.
I think we'd be talking about moral goodness. I'm less sure. It might be. I think maybe God also has every kind of. I'm not sure if there are other kinds of value. Like, I don't know if epistemic value is real or something, or if it is real, if it's the right kind of thing that God has, or if like aesthetic value is real. I'm kind of sympathetic to aesthetic anti-realism, so I don't have a super strong view. So like maybe something like that. But it at least has unlimited moral goodness. It would either be unlimited moral goodness or like axiological goodness, or unlimited value of all kinds. Not sure which one, but you were asking why I think moral realism is true. The reason I think moral realism is true is it seems certain things would be wrong even if I approved of them. It seems like even if everybody in the world approved of like going around torturing and raping babies, it would still be wrong to torture and murder babies. And so if that's true, then if that judgment is correct, that everyone agreeing on some moral fact wouldn't make it true, then it's not stance dependent, right? If we imagine in the world,
In fairness,
where
I
everyone
actually wasn't
agrees-
trying to attack moral realism. I have.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, it's good what you're saying because you articulate it quite well. No, I guess then I was going back to, because I think in order from theism, to try to have a strong predictive, in order to have strong predictions from theism to the kind of world that we live in, or some sort of world that's similar to like the kind of world we live in, right? I think you need to put certain motivations that God would desire X, God would desire this, and that this follows from this idea of unlimited goodness. And to me, it's not clear to me. To me, that's kind of a strong form of like value realism in a sense. Like, are we really to expect like the gods desire beings like me that like something analogous to food that has certain flavors similar to like, and then once we start going more abstract, okay, well, just some sort of beings at all with some sort of relationship to each other, that at least that's predicted on theism. Then we just start to get into weird territory. Like, it seems like theism still isn't that simple, because we have to put all these desires into God, and then it just starts to weakly predict the data. Whereas we have competing atheistic hypotheses that I think are simpler, even though they don't predict the data as well. And so, to me, it results in me not preferring theism over atheistic alternatives.
I agree with you that that theism won't specifically predict many very like specific things about the world, right? Like theism won't predict that like my name is Matthew, or that I have exactly the culinary preferences I have. But neither does atheism predict that. Now you might think atheism sort of predicts the broad, once you account for certain background features, atheism predicts sort of a broadly indifferent universe where you get an evolutionary process that might make things like this. But then I think you can add that as an auxiliary hypothesis to theism. And while it doesn't have a super high probability on theism, the more specific version of theism, where you say theism is true and God wants to put us in a different universe, that can explain all those things just as well as atheism. Now, I agree that doesn't have a super high probability, but because it explains the data so well, we ought to accept it. It gets all the explanatory advantage of both theism and atheism. We need one more stipulation, which was the thing I described before about God wanting us to be able to understand the broad contours of the world. So yeah,
like the broad contours of the world. Would you put that like in a moral domain, or more of a value kind of domain?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I would think it's like God wants us to be able to figure out the broad kind of like theological truths about the world, truths about mathematics, the modal realm, the moral realm, maybe the aesthetic realm, if there is such a realm, stuff like that. Like God would want us, for the things that are really important to how the world works, or at least many of them, God would want us to be able to know those things. And while I agree that is an extra posit that'll lower the probability, it explains a lot of different things, where it explains fine-tuning for discoverability, it explains moral math, the sort of our non-natural ability to grasp moral, mathematical, and modal knowledge. It explains the wide variety.
Do you kind of get my basic thought? It's the idea is kind of like we seem to have to posit a desire for people to discover things in order to predict the fact that something is discoverable. That's kind of the basic idea motivating, and I think we can do that with other motivations that God has. And that's my worry, I would say, is it seems we're just taking what needs to be explained and we're adding a feature to God that happens to explain it. Like I don't think discoverability is like some sort of moral truth or something like that. It seems like some sort of different value.
Well, so I agree that it would be a problem if we were like constantly adding just as an extra stipulation for every specific thing that theism explained. There was no motivation for things theism explained that, so we just had to add it as an arbitrary designer. But my claim is we can explain all the facts about the world with three all the things that are evidence for God, each of which are, and they're like 15 or 20 of them that are surprising on atheism. They can all be explained actually, with like one exception where we'll have to, well, I don't know. Anyways, it'll get kind of unclear, but nearly all of these can be explained. And the ones that can't will be even more surprising on atheism. And even if you don't, we can just jettison those on the theory that God wants us to put us in an indifferent universe and to have the sort of broad kinds of knowledge. So God exists. He wants to put us in a different universe and have knowledge about the broad contours of the world. That's not very many stipulations. That's a lot more stipulations than the comparable atheist theory, which posits each of the 15 facts as brute. And so then I think you're not going to have to. It's like evolutionists will also have to. And by the way, to be clear, I'm an evolutionist. I think evolution obviously happened, but. Like with the theory of evolution, you're going to need to think that there are certain basic stipulations, right? So you're going to have to think, there was abiogenesis and this and that. And even once you have that, it doesn't predict with certainty all the like it's not guaranteed that apes would evolve with a thumb thing. It's just that it's more strongly predicted on that than on alternative theories. And so it's evidence for evolution. And so similarly with God, we get a few basic stipulations that predict most of the things with high probability, some of them with not super high probability, but still with much higher probability than comparable atheistic theories. And then we can argue that these things, that each of the steps is kind of motivated, that each of the things that we're adding into God are like, not that improbable. And so then together the theory starts to look really good because just with a few stipulations, it explains a lot. So Gabe, we have been talking for quite a bit. And so I want to give other people the chance to talk. You can have a last word and then I'll respond.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, by the way.
My show.
I was also about to suggest that I do that since I think I've been here longest, assuming you have two people in the
I'll jump after this. That's totally fine.
No, I mean, I assume there are more than one person in the waiting room, right?
There are exactly two people in the waiting room.
Okay, so I'll jump out right after Gabe after giving a parting shot, but you can go first, Gabe.
Yeah, so I think that's my main worry. I think the last thing that I mentioned, this idea of, so I think maybe the way you were framing it is like properly motivated posits, for the God hypothesis, and like unmotivated or badly motivated ones. And I think that's fair. I guess my question would be is I still have my concerns that maybe all of it is not properly motivated. I'm not saying it's intentional, but so like I think ultimately my concern is we need to posit first a being, but then a being that desires to do X in order to get these posits X. And like we can do this when it comes to discoverability. And even the idea of wanting, like desiring perfect goodness to do perfect goodness or whatever it is. Like I think you need to posit two things in theism. I think you need to posit like being in itself somehow, and then and then this qualifier on the being in and of itself versus like something like indifference, which seems to be like one very, very different posit, or I wouldn't even say indifference. Like if on atheism, I think if you had like the simplest thing would be something like a universe that like a universe generator, something that creates every possible universe. And yes, our universe is not as well explained by that, but it seems to me that it's a simpler hypothesis, and the only way why theism has better predictive power is because we're saying, well, we are positing a being that has the desire X to explain phenomena X. And to me, it's no real surprise that theism then becomes greater in predictive power. That's my worry. It's kind of my concern with some of these things.
Yeah, I can see that. So here's maybe an analogy. So imagine we see a bunch of art projects in my room. It's true that the mere theory that, so you can have two theories. One theory is that the art just like materialized for no reason. And the other theory is that the art was made by me. You might say, look, there's no special reason to think I would make that art or that art or that art. But the point is, we can have a theory that just says, look, I'm an artist, I'm interested in art, and then it'll predict that there will be a bunch of art projects. Now, it won't predict the specificities, but neither will the other theory. And so similarly, I think we can add into God's nature just a few stipulations that are pretty plausible, and then it'll nicely predict the data, like, for example, saying that God desires to put us in a different universe, and and wants to give us sort of knowledge of the broad contours of the world. And then from there, we just, with just a few stipulations, I claim there is no fact that a naturalistic theory explains better than that theistic theory. And so it's just a few stipulations rather than
evil, right?
No, because we.
Oh no,
stipulated,
you have your population thing. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we stipulated that God would put us in an indifferent universe. That was one of the stipulations. So evil is not an advantage over that because it sort of co-opts the hypothesis of indifference.
Sure. So I will give my sort of parting shot as well, which is like I think this framing where you have a few theistic assumptions, and we can argue about whether or not they do explain all of the things, but let's just take that as read, and you're comparing them to a number of atheistic assumptions that the atheistic theory needs to make in order to explain all of the same facts. Is like this counting of stipulations is just not the right way to do things. The stipulations can be much simpler than other stipulations, I think. And I think the theistic stipulations are really not very simple at all. They're certainly any attempt to like do an actual formal calculation of their simplicity is going to be hugely difficult. Whereas the atheistic stipulations, with one except, if we exclude fine tuning for a moment, which I agree is the hardest thing to explain, you can get a fairly simple atheistic theory that's just sort of following the fundamental strategy of naturalism, which is that math is a really simple thing, and we can describe a physical universe fairly simply with math, and then the only remaining sort of question is how simple are these consciousness stipulations and whether or not you can get them for free. And I think comparing those two things is just a much harder job than you're making it out to seem by counting 18 versus 3,
yeah, I certainly
you
agree.
You have to weigh them, and it's not clear to me how you're weighing certainly the theistic ones and some of the atheistic ones.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that once you have an atheistic world, that like you don't just count up the number of stipulations, especially because any stipulation can be decomposed into an infinite number of stipulations, and you can also make an infinite number of stipulations decomposed into one by just using the word and. But my point is that you want to look at the probability of them. So, okay, let's look at the probability of the 3. And in general, more stipulations is going to be worse because it's more things that lower the probability, right? So we say, okay, there's a God. I think that has a high prior probability. I certainly think like that has a higher probability than a physical universe. But anyways, you could disagree about that. But okay, maybe you think it's low, maybe you think it's medium, but okay, some probability. Then you say, God wants to put us in an indifferent universe. Okay, that has a pretty low probability. And then last, you say God wants us to figure out the broad contours of the world. I don't really know what the probability of that is conditional on the other things. I think probably neither super low nor super high, sort of in the middle. But so, okay, theism, there are a lot of things that lower its probability. But then from this, it explains everything very, very nicely. In contrast, naturalism, here's their theory. Physical stuff exists. That's low probability. Like, it would be simpler for none of it to exist. There are laws. That's low probability. Simpler for that not to exist. The laws apply to...
It would be simpler for that not to exist applies to your assumptions as well, though.
I agree. No, I agree that they're both low.
And you have to weigh that simplicity against each other.
They both involve assumptions that are low probability. My point is just there's so many of these assumptions that are low probability, and I don't think that and I think many of them are really, really low probability, that together they just completely sink naturalism, while in contrast, theism has less low probability assumptions that are better able to explain the relevant data.
So are you getting these low probability estimates more from intuition or more from simplicity, or, obviously?
Oh, I think it's from intuition, because I don't think simplicity is a virtue in anything but the fundamental things, right? So if
some of the atheistic things are fundamental things, right? So
so for the things that are taken to be fundamental, then it's a combination of intuition and simplicity. It's just the standard way you'd figure out the probabilities of things.
All right. On that note, I'll dip, and I'll probably.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been an
background.
interesting discussion. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Yeah.
See ya.
Peace out, Doug.
Wait, how?
You can just okay. Oh wait. I'll add PB. Okay, because PB got there first. Sorry, Jeremy, but I'll add you later. Okay. Who have I not spoken with yet? I haven't spoken with you, Muhammad, yet, right?
Yeah, no.
Or wait. I haven't spoken with Daniel. Have I spoken with Daniel? I don't remember.
No, you haven't spoken with me or Daniel.
Julian came first, but yeah.
Okay, I'll speak with Julian first. How's it going, Julian?
Going pretty good. I have problems with your views on fine tuning, and then I also have problems with your other views on morality pointing to God, stuff like that. But I want to really talk about the fine tuning stuff.
Oh, just to be clear, I don't think morality points to God. I think moral knowledge points to God, but I don't think God is like the foundation of morality. But okay, yeah.
Okay, so I've a few concerns with your fine tuning. Why do you think it's much more highly expected under theism than naturalism?
Well, I think the reason is that the probability is so once we have the theistic stipulations that I talked about, where it's like God wants us to be able to figure out the broad contours of the world, and that's sort of like the best theistic theory, and that God wants to put us in a different universe. That predicts fine tuning with pretty, with high probability, where decent chance, or at least not terribly low chance, that the laws would be fragile in that sense, given that that's sort of like the most naturalistic way it could look. In contrast, on naturalism, given that you could have the values, given that your prior distribution should be equal across all the possible values, maybe not exactly equal, but sort of around equal, the prior probability of, say, the cosmological constant falling in this very, very narrow range, that's about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120th of its possible values, prior probability of that is very, very, very near zero. And so for that reason, you should think almost certainly on atheism, there wouldn't be fine tuning. While on theism, it's not that unlikely, and so then fine-tuning is evidence for theism.
Okay, my first bone to pick with that is, in the situation you're giving, I watched a couple of your talks, and you've been maintaining that these sort of inferences you're making are, very good inferences. But when you're predicting that, okay, the cosmological constants are fine-tuned in a way that's very unlikely, you're fixing all of the other constants, and then you're changing one. You're not detecting for the other permutations that may come from mixing around the values of the constants or whatever. And there's a huge epistemological issue here saying that you're making this assumption that, okay, if we fix a bunch of the other constants and change one, that will be reflective of the total probability space. But we lack epistemic access to the other probabilities that, may ensue from changing, the combinations of the values that you can get, and there seems to be a lot of
so I disagree on two fronts. First is I think this is just wrong about the physics. Luke Barnes has written about this, where we can actually look at lots of cases where we differ many of the constants at once, and when we do that, stuff doesn't form. Second of all, I think that even aside from the physics point, it's just wrong as a matter of probability. So it's a tricky point to describe. So the proposal is that, so the idea is that our laws of physics are fragile in the sense that if you tweak them slightly, then no interesting stuff would arise. Now your proposal is, okay, maybe the probability of our laws in particular are fragile, but this doesn't mean that the probability of life is low, because there could be vast islands of non-fragile laws in possibility space that are not fragile, that you could change the values a lot and they wouldn't. And so maybe a lot of probability space has interesting and valuable laws. I think the worry that there are two ways to this is wrong. The first one is, suppose this were true, almost certainly we would have non-fragile laws. If it were true that lots of modal, let's imagine that the prior probability of a life permitting universe was 30%. The probability that we get the fragile laws that are 1 part in 10 to the 120th of the sort of nearby values, the probability we'd get that would be almost zero, because almost certainly we would get one of the non-fragile ones that's surrounded by non-fragile ones. Second of all, what's relevant isn't just the probability that there's a life permitting universe in the first place. What matters, you have to take a more specific fact, which is that we have our specific life permitting universe, right? So here's an analogy. Let's imagine there are two ways to get into a house. One of them is you enter 20 numbers, the right code of 20 numbers to get in through the front door, to enter the right code to get in. And the second one is you just have to enter one number to get in the back. Suppose you get into the house by entering through the front door, and someone says, oh, almost certainly, you were cheating. You got the code ahead of time. And you say, no, the probability of me getting into the house is only 1 in 10. And so it's not that unlikely. We have to take the more specific fact, which is that you got in through the front door. And so the more specific fact is that we hit this value of the cosmological constant that was in this very narrow range, that if you tweaked it slightly, it would arise. Well, the probability of that in particular is less than 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. And so the probability of that more specific fact, that we have these very, very fragile laws, isn't affected by those other islands. And it's very, very low probability and better explained by theism. Okay, well, I have, I guess, multiple bones to pick with what you said there. So, I mean, the first thing I wanted to mention is that we have, in most cases, we have very non-fragile and rigid laws of physics. And I don't really know if this, answers anything, because it seems like the same epistemology you're arriving would also apply to these physical laws. So, like, you're using the same epistemology where you're holding the other physical laws constant, and you're looking at this one specific physical law and observing that, okay, if you change it, it's not going to work with the rest of the laws of physics. So you're using the same epistemology you use that I'm questioning to arrive at this conclusion that, the laws of physics are not fragile. So, I mean, I think it's quite circular. I don't... wait, before I respond to that, let me just say something else, which is that I'm getting a bit tired of doing this. So other people don't join the Zoom call, because I probably won't take any more callers. Maybe I'll have Jeremy come in, who's in the waiting room. But yeah, happy to. I'll finish up chatting with all of you who are in the room right now, but not taking any more callers. Sorry. Okay, so you're saying, well, that it's the same method. No, it's not. The point is that the value of the constants, the constants are fragile in the sense that if you tweak like one of the constants, no interesting things would arise. And so if that's right, then it is surprising that we would have fragile constants if there are lots of nearby values where the constants are not fragile, right?
But I'm not claiming the constants are fragile in that way.
Wait, sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
I'm not claiming the constants are fragile in the way that you're suggesting.
Okay, you deny that the constants are fragile.
In the way you're suggesting, yes. I think if you fix a bunch of the constants and change the value of a singular one, you're going to get chaos, the result of most of those.
Oh, sorry. When I said it was fragile, I just mean that if you tweak one of the constants, then no interesting stuff would arise.
Yeah, I'm not questioning that. I'm questioning that there's like other combinations where if you arrange the values of any of these constants, then,
No, but right. So I'm saying that the fact that we have fragile constants, in the sense that if you tweak one of them, no interesting stuff would arise, that gives us good reason to think that there aren't these vast islands where if you just tweak one of them, like vast islands in modal space, where tweaking the constants doesn't make the stuff not arise. Now, maybe your suggestion is that let's see, it's hard. This stuff, it gets very tricky to describe, but maybe the idea is that just there are a lot of like suppose you think that what matters is something like the ratio between the constants or something. So if you just doubled the value of all the constants, then life would arise. So the idea is that there are lots of these cases where life could arise if you tweak multiple of the constants. But the point is, if most of these are fragile in the sense that tweaking one of the constants would make life not arise, then it's very unlikely that you'd have, for any particular constant, it's unlikely that it would be at the value that produces interesting stuff, right? So once you have, so the probability that even if you take as the background the other laws, the probability that you'd have the cosmological constant be in this narrow range where it gives rise to interesting stuff, the probability of that is very low, because the cosmological constant has so many values that it could take on. And so even after you set all the other values, it's unlikely that that the cosmological constant, say, would fall in this narrow range. And so it's still going to be extremely low probability on atheism. So I have a paper. If you send me a message on Discord, I can send you a paper that I was writing about this argument.
Okay, I'll reach out. But like I have a problem with what you're saying. So are you making the inference that from, in order, like, let's look at the whole modal space or whatever, and you're fixing a bunch of these constants, the fact that if you change a singular one of those constants, it will result in chaos means it's likely that all the other combinations are resulting in chaos? Are you saying something like, well, I'm curious why, we have to select for this particular universe, and this particular universe has the constants fixed in a particular way, and I want to explain why we're picking for this particular universe.
So what I'm saying is that imagine you think that the constants. So let's say just ignore. There are lots of fragile constants, but let's just ignore all of them other than the cosmological constant. The more that you have, the worse the case gets for you. But the point is, so maybe there are lots of different values, right? So maybe if the cosmological constant at its current value produces life. But if the cosmological constant were very different, then you could have different values of the other laws, and those would produce life. So then there are two possibilities. Possibility one is that there are lots of other values that the constants could take on, where a huge range of values of the cosmological constant would support life. Okay, so in that picture, like maybe let's just to make a very toy model. Okay, let's say that there's just one other force, and that force has a value of x. And if its value were 10x, then any value of the cosmological constant that it could take on would be perfectly fine with life. And then it's true. That means that the probability of life arising would be high. But the point is, then it's super unlikely that we would not have the value at 10x, but we would have the value at x, where it is fragile. So if you think that there are this wide range, that for any particular value, if you think that there's this wide range in modal space where it's not fragile, then you have to think that the odds that particular thing would take on the value, that we get the particular value that we have where it is fragile are vanishingly low, and it doesn't affect the probability at all of getting fragile laws like ours by saying that maybe there's a large part of modal space that's non-fragile, any more than saying that there are multiple ways to get into a room, one of which is low probability, affects the probability of getting into the room the other way in the analogy that I gave before.
Okay, I think I understand, but I still have some issues with that. So, like, the first thing is that I'm not saying, of course, I said this earlier, that, well, looking at the other, combinations, we expect there to be non-fragile laws. The laws are still fragile in the way you're describing. It's just that many combinations would work. And this would ultimately explain why we have life. So it would predict that we have life, which is one of the things that the theists want to explain.
Wait, Julian, can you mute your Discord? There are a lot of Discord beeps.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Julian must be famous. He's got a lot of notifications.
Hopefully I don't crash.
And Julian, I do want to wrap this up sort of soon because I am getting kind of tired, but I would be happy to do another live stream. I do these, regularly-ish, maybe like once a month. So yeah, come on when I'm next doing.
Yeah, I think if I open my Discord, my PC is going to crash. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was going to be the stalking horse objection, but I recommend you just talk to Daniel about it because I'm going to hop off and I'll watch the rest.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Julian. Good meeting you. Hey, Daniel.
How you doing?
Doing well.
That's good to hear.
Wait, are you wearing? Wait, it's hard to see. My screen's black and white because I have my computer be on black and white so that things are less distracting. But it looks. Do you have a kippah on in your profile picture?
Yeah, I'm wearing a yarmulke.
Okay, are you? You're also a fellow Jew.
I am a fellow Jew. So
okay, so that's all.
I was filled with pride when I found out you got. I think we published in Synthesis or something. Our people are winning. Win the war. Yeah, I wanted to talk about, I think, some stuff pertaining to the stalking horse objection. I know that some other people talked to you about that before, and I think that, it's going to play a little bit into some of the previous conversation you were having with Julian. And that's just going to be, we could make claims, I'll phrase it like this. So at least in response to the loss point, maybe I'll ask you this question, is even though I think I agree with you with the example that you gave, it was a house example or something, right? Where someone goes in, they get the right password immediately, but there could have been other options. If they would have went around, they could have easily got in. Was that the example you were giving, Julian? I think I heard it from a different channel that cited you or something. Or
Did you hear it from Apologetics Squared?
yeah, that's where I heard it from.
Yeah, that guy's great. Yeah.
I think he cited you though for the example. The problem I'm having with that then is that if we did, I agree with you. Then we would want to use the most specific evidence we have here and say, okay, well, the probability that if this person, given that this person actually approached the building, that they would get that password. But I think you get a problem now, and maybe this goes into a problem of divine psychology, of trying to say, well, what's the probability that God is going to configure the laws in this particular way? Just overall. So even though, given the specific piece of evidence we have, you still may, the overall probability, right, that he made it such that, the laws are going to be configured, or I guess the universe has a particular set of constants given the laws that it has, as opposed to a different set of laws and therefore a completely different constant, right? I wonder if you think that's going to play substantially in lowering the prior probability now for the theist claim.
Yeah, so anytime you have a theory that predicts any specific fact, like the prior probability of a theory, God exists and would make X the exact cosmological constant, that theory has a very low prior. And this is just a general fact about any specific hypothesis. The theory that I would say this exact sentence has an extremely low prior. The theory that I would write any exact article has a low prior, etc. So the more specific you make it, the lower the prior will be. What we want is broad general features of the scenario that are more strongly predicted on one hypothesis than the other. Right. So consider the fact that if I write a blog post, we have two theories. One theory is that I wrote the blog post. One theory is that a bird one theory is that, like, let's say someone stole my computer and wrote a blog post. Mm-hmm. It's true that it'll be very, very, very difficult to figure out the probability that someone who stole my computer would write that exact blog post. But the point is, the theory that I would write a blog post has a high prior, while the theory that someone stole my computer and then would write a blog post, that has a very low prior. And so for that reason, you should think probably, like, those probabilities, one's higher than the other. And then the odd that it would be that particular blog post conditional on that is similar between the two hypotheses. And so for that reason, it's not going to be a big boost to either hypothesis. So I think anytime you have a specific hypothesis, it'll be the sort of thing that it's like, any specific hypothesis is going to be like that, where a theory that predicts something very specific is going to have a low prior. By the way, Michael Birdwell, who I'm not going to take any more callers just because I've been going for a while. Michael Birdwell is the person in the backstage. So so sorry about that.
That's I think I agree with you. Yeah, if you're going to make a more specific hypothesis, then it is going to be weighty on the you have to definitely lower the prior probabilities a bit. I wonder how you're able to now calculate the priors, or even have a good idea what the priors are relative to, let's say, a naturalist hypothesis or something like an atheist hypothesis, because the kind of the work that you're doing now, where we're saying, well, look, I'm acknowledging the fact that given this specific piece of data obtaining, the conditional probability is going to be higher given this hypothesis, but because there could have been so many alternatives, what's the probability that God made it in this particular way? And now it just seems like, well, you're working with it just seems like a really, really, really low prior probability, where someone can now step in and say, look, the naturalist seems to be able to do, quite a similar thing now, where we want to say, look, there could be, it could be really low under naturalism as well. Maybe we give naturalism a particular disposition in the same way we're giving theism a disposition, and we're kind of trying to work out both hypotheses as being at least equally probable. We're not trying to. The idea is I don't see a reason to favor now the theist hypothesis now, if we're already kind of jam packing those priors, because you could do the same with the naturalist hypothesis, and it seemed
So the idea is that I think there are two specific features that are more strongly predicted on theism. So theism will predict both laws that are capable of generating interesting structures and constants that fall in a range where they generate interesting structures. And so beyond that, it doesn't make any more specific predictions and the way he'd do that would be the cosmological constant, but neither does naturalism. So in terms of the specificities beyond that, it's equal between the two hypotheses. But the fact that you have constants that produce interesting things and and laws that are capable of producing interesting structures, but those are more strongly predicted on theism than on naturalism.
Yeah, what do you mean by interesting structures?
like, I mean, it's hard, it's hard to give a precise definition, just like it is of most words, but that like don't just produce valueless soup of no particles ever interacting, everything shooting off into space, or things just sitting there doing nothing, or like moving in a circle. Some laws that are capable of like producing structures that form in more complicated ways and are capable of giving rise to agents. Wait, sorry, this is an aside, but did you and I have a phone call about the inverse gambler's fallacy charge a while ago?
We did have that phone call, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was you. Okay.
You recognize my voice?
Yeah, you sound familiar.
Good memory. Okay, good memory there.
Thank you.
I still haven't received a text back. I sent you a paper by Tyron Goldschmidt.
Oh, sorry about that. Wait, and are you an atheist Jew or a theist Jew?
I'm not a theist. Yeah, atheist.
Sad.
Well, you don't even give
yeah, wait, you were like a massive like reductionist. You didn't
I
believe in anything. You were like an anti-realist.
You're even worse. You think Judaism is even less probable than Christianity. I mean, what is this?
That's true.
They train your people over here.
But that's only because I think Christianity is not that improbable.
So what question did I just ask? Oh yeah, the interesting structural stuff. Oh, because you had a question. You said it was very hard to define the stuff with interesting structures. And then you mentioned something about agents, like was it moral agents or something having value? Was it, or we wouldn't expect, like, if there's something particular about like moral agents, us seeing moral agents or something?
Wait, so which factor are you talking about?
So you asked a question, and then you brought up the phone call that threw me off of what your question was or what your statement was.
Oh, I don't remember.
Well, this is what I will say, at least for the interesting structure stuff. I'm not so convinced that that there's any reason for a theistic hypothesis to like favor this set of interesting structures, as opposed to like such an astronomically large landscape of the kind of interesting structures you have. I know Joseph Schmid brought this point up. I think in the comment section of one of your videos, at least in regards to the moral agents point. But it seems like, like if we want to say something like, okay, well, there's a world where we have moral agents in them versus God, creates a world with just life in them. These aren't, moral agents or something like that. I don't see why we would think, one is going to be more favorable than the other, especially since we could give a bunch of facts about our world that are going to create a kind of, disvalue to the kind of interesting structures that we have. People feel pain, they're suffering, not just mere problem of evil concerns, maybe there's something more substantive there. So I'm not really sure why we would think like, this is going to be the kind of creation God makes, as opposed to, a myriad of reasons we're going to assign under at least like a brute theist model, which I would assume we would have to take up or something before,
I agree I agree that theism doesn't predict like humans existing in particular. But I don't think atheism does either, right? Like neither theory makes any predictions about the sorts of creatures that would exist. Now, theism does make a prediction. Probably the creatures would be really awesome. But if we have the stipulation that God would put us in an indifferent universe, then that explains just as well as atheism, there being human creatures like us that are sort of vulnerable and weak in various ways and morally deficient in various ways and so on and so forth. So I think theism doesn't have too bad of a time explaining that. On contrast, atheism, you just need a lot of ingredients to have agents like us that are poorly explained by atheism.
Well, that's fine. I'm not making the claim that something like atheism is going to have higher predictive power. It's just to say that I don't see how, if you want to make an argument in favor of theism, right? And I don't see, at least the criticism I'm presenting is that I don't see how theism is going to at least present any more of a better hypothesis than atheism, right? Either for the reason, like, again, if we just want to keep our, priors very simple about God, we would definitely, the conditional probability is going to suffer here. We're definitely not going to expect the kind of things that we observe. Again, whether it just, again, it's not just of evil, but just the kind of life we see is just like why this life is opposed to any other life. And other people want to point out too, right?
Neither theism nor atheism predicts that. That's not an advantage for either theory. So that's like in the case of the person stealing my computer versus me typing it out. Neither theory makes any predictions about what the article would be like, but both of the theories that, but one of the theories makes a higher probability just like of there being an article at all And so as a result, like neither theism or
I'm not proposing an argument for atheism. It's not like I'm giving actually fine-tuning actually is better predicted on atheism. I mean, that's not my point. It's just to say that if fine-tuning isn't going to be better predicted under the theism, right? That it's not something that there's not really a very convincing argument here that the theism.
Fine-tuning is better predicted under theism. The point is, what theism predicts is that you would have agents of some sort with much higher probability. Beyond that, it doesn't make predictions about what the agents are like. And so it doesn't predict, if you have agents of some sort, probably they'd be human. But neither does atheism. So neither theory makes, I think atheism does make better sense, because atheism doesn't need the extra stipulation of an indifferent universe, because atheism just naturally predicts an indifferent universe. So for this to be evidence for the existence of God, you don't need to build into your hypothesis that like neither theory, atheism will have a slightly better explanation, but not that much better, of the fact that you have agents that are human like us and that are vulnerable in various ways, and it won't have a superior time explaining that over the sort of modified theistic theory where you say God wants to put us in an indifferent universe. But then theism has an advantage in explaining many of the ingredients required for this: why there's physical stuff, why there are laws, why the laws apply to the stuff, why they produce interesting structures, why they're finely tuned constants, and so on.
Yeah, I'm not. I guess I mean, you're saying theism.
Oh, sorry. Just to address the one other thing you said, you were saying, well, it's not evidence for theism. You're not claiming it's evidence for atheism. But my point is that so we have two classes of fact. Class of fact one is that there are necessary ingredients for agents, and then class of fact two is that the agents that it gives rise to are agents like humans. I think the second fact is an evidence either way, and the first fact is very strong evidence for theism. But I'll give you a last word, but then I want to talk to the other people because I.
Gotcha, no worries. I know it's running late on your end. I'll just say this, right? I mean, I'm not really sure how when we say theism is going to better predict something here, like better predict at least agents existing. I mean, I guess it depends on the kind of theism we're talking about, right? I'm not sure why a brute theism is going to, or it's not pressing brute, sorry, a bare theism. I probably said brute the whole time. A bare theism is going to be predicting anything, like anything particular here, whether agents exist or anything. And just bare theism such that there's just going to be this necessary being or something. I'm not sure why we would make that stipulation. Now, if you want to, like, again, keep on, packing in those priors and want to say, well, look, something like the kind of God that is described by like a lot of monotheistic religions is going to be able to do this. I think that's fine, but I'm just going to say, well, look, now that just seems to be, the priors just seem to be incredibly low on this. And if you want to do that, right, if you want to add in that kind of disposition to your bare theism to make it where it has a higher probability of predicting something like, life conducive conditions or whatever the case, agents or something, right? And I think the naturalists would just do the exact same thing. And so it doesn't really seem to be that theism is going to be outcompeting naturalism as a type of hypothesis here. But like I guess that's all I have to say on the matter. If you want to speak to other people, that's fine. I'll leave. Great talking to you.
Yeah, good talking to you. Yeah, and sorry, ping me via text message, and I'll remind me to respond to the paper. Yeah, because sometimes I just forget.
No, you're all good. You're good. I'll probably also ask you your Discord or something if you're active on it.
Yeah, like sounds good. All right, peace out. Have a good one. And Vikram, sorry, I'm not having more callers, so yeah. Okay, Mohammed Wing, how are you doing?
Yep, good. How are you?
I'm doing.
Wait, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah. I don't really have any strong objections. I just have a sort of a point of slight disagreement. I think that, well, to start, I'm not a moral realist. I don't think I'm not really interested in having a moral realism debate right now. But because the objections I'm making, yeah, I think the objections I'm making can be made without presuming that moral anti-realism is true. I just think that it makes more sense for the fundamental property of God to be unlimited mind or unlimited power, more the latter, I think, than to be unlimited goodness. I think that the reason I think this, there are a few reasons. Obviously, one of them is that I'm not a moral anti-realist. But the more important one, I think, so we have the problem of evil. Your response to the problem of evil makes sense to me, that it makes sense for God to put us in a morally indifferent universe so we can learn so we can come to understand the contours of the world. It's just not clear to me why a God who is unlimitedly good by your understanding of good would want to create a universe that, although indifferent, includes a large number of conscious beings who won't be able to understand the contours of the world, and B, I'm just not sure why. I'm not sure why this would be the way for this unlimitedly good being. Why the unlimitedly good being would want to put us in a indifferent universe. I'm not sure why us understanding, or conscious beings understanding the contours of the world, is something they would particularly value. I just think it's more parsimonious for the being to just be really powerful.
Well, if you say that he is really powerful, then you also have to add in a bunch of brute stipulations as to what his motivations are, and those are going to start to look kind of weird. And then it'll less strongly predict the very valuable features of the world, like psychophysical harmony. And so and then it'll be less simple, because just infinite power, that's not enough by itself. Now, you can say infinite power is enough by itself if you think infinite power involves omniscience, which involves knowing the moral facts and then acting on them. But then that would just also result in a perfect being.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I don't think that. I guess perhaps it was like I shouldn't have started this by saying I'm not a moral realist, because I think it is also possible that if moral facts exist, it could also be plausible that this God is unlimitedly good because it's unlimitedly powerful and is thus omniscient. But I just don't think that it's I just think it's much simpler to think that it is definitely unlimitedly good. I think it may be the case, I think it is definitely the case that it is unlimitedly powerful, and by virtue of that, omniscient. I think it is possible that it's unlimitedly good, but I don't think that's certainly the case.
Yeah, I think these are all valid approaches, but I didn't think your approach has an advantage, because it also involves it being perfect, and so then you get the same worries about the problem of evil. Right? I think you're going to have a perfect being in order for theism to make its predictive powers, and so. Yeah, so I think you're going to have it be perfect, and then you're just going to need something to say about the problem of evil. In terms of the hypothesis of indifference stuff, well, yeah, so most creatures don't know about like the broad contours of the world, probably. Well, it's not clear, because maybe the future will have a bunch of humans. But anyways, but most of the value comes from like comes from an indifferent world where we're separated from God, that might enhance our eventual relationship with God. It might unlock all sorts of unknown goods. We have the opportunity to help each other. This applies even to even to animals. We're able to help them. They're able to help us, and they're able to help other animals. So I think while animal suffering is a bit more puzzling, the same broad point about how there's something valuable about us being in an indifferent universe, especially if you think there are lots of maybe like not other like spiritual entities like angels who can form a relationship with the animals, that could be valuable. Like, think about that. If you help out an animal in this life avoid suffering, that will eternally strengthen your relationship with their afterlife instantiation. And I expect animals in the afterlife to be very intelligent and wise and so on, just like I expect us in the afterlife to not just be human and fallible. So for that reason, I think that animal suffering can be justified in a similar way, where the valuable thing comes from these broad contours of the world. You can also add more, like, there are more theological options. Like the soul, it makes sense of soul building, where animals also sort of struggle and suffer. There also is something valuable about just having novelty in your life, where like, maybe the best life does include, a few days of being weak and vulnerable, and sort of like actually experiencing what that's like, rather than just sort of understanding it as an abstract, purely intellectual matter.
Yeah, I think that's all like fairly plausible. I'll just close by saying that I still lean towards thinking that I think it is still fairly probable that God is unlimitedly powerful, all-knowing, but does not share our moral intuitions about the sort of things you just list. I think that's plausible.
Sorry, are you a theist?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
not like I'm really not like well read enough to certainly say that I am, but I think yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks for chatting,
Okay, cool.
Mohammed.
Yeah, that's not my real name for the record, but yeah.
Okay. Have a good one. Okay, PB, you're up.
Hey Matthew, I know you want to take a break soon, so I'll try to make this quick. Just two basic questions. The first one is, well, actually, first of all, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, you're a little loud. Can you turn down your mic audio slightly?
Let me see how I can do that.
Yeah.
Any better?
Yeah, it's good now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the first question I wanted to ask was, to what extent would you say your case for theism in your writings implies any particular form of theism, like classical theism or neoclassical theism? And, I'm actually particularly interested in how it might relate to more monistic forms of theism, like panentheism.
So I don't think that the things I say generally distinguish between, like, generally support like classical theism versus neoclassical theism. I mean, they support perfect being theism, but they don't tell us what the nature of the perfect being. I'm not super sympathetic to classical theism. I think Joe Schmidt has some convincing criticisms of it. It seems like bullshit to me. It's very hard to make sense of. It's very mysterious. I think it's like they say God is the same thing as his power and then the same thing as his goodness, but then when that makes his power the same as his goodness, the response to that or not convincing. I don't know. I find that implausible. Panentheism, I don't remember what that is, so I don't
That's
know.
one where the universe is contained within God, so it's not like identical to God as pantheism would say, but it's contained within. And so, like Spinoza, I think, is supposed to be one of the representatives of this view. I've seen it like nowadays, like in conjunction with different kinds of idealism.
Yeah, I don't think the view tells us, like, helps distinguish between the like things as granular as that. Like, the arguments I give are general arguments for theism, and I don't think they'll tell us whether pantheism is true or panentheism or like just panless theism. But yeah, I don't have super strong views about those things. I think probably I lean towards thinking they're false. They just seem kind of weird. But like it's not a subject I've thought much about. Like it seems sort of it just seems impossible for like a physical world to be within a non-physical being. But I don't have a strong view on it. I'm not an expert on it. Haven't given it much thought.
Oh, no, that's totally fair. And I think that a lot of anyone who'd want to be a panentheist is probably going to be inclined towards some kind of monism. So it'll have to be like an idealist of some kind or neutral monist. So yeah, I agree with you. It's weird to posit a physical universe existing in a non-physical being. So anyways, that's helpful. I think the second question I had is, I know you kind of got into this earlier, but I missed that part of the discussion. For your objective list utilitarianism, what would you include on the list, and how would you adjudicate how would you like weigh different goods on the list against each other? Like, pleasure versus, I think you've said relationships might be a good that you include.
Yeah. So I think that what you do is you'd want to look at so in order to adjudicate these things, you want to look at, you're just going to be relying on intuitions and trying to do moral philosophy like this. So I think the things that are on the objective list, pleasure, certainly, relationships, I'm also pretty sold on. Maybe knowledge, maybe achievements, maybe something else. Hard to know. And the way you figure these out is you just rely on intuition. So it's like, okay, imagine two people, one of whom has a ton of, they have equally happy lives. They have the same amount of pleasure in their life. But when this person is just like a hermit who gets all his pleasure from masturbating, and the other person is, has all these valuable relationships with other people. They help them out. They're deeply in love with other people. Seems like the second person has a better life. And so it seems like there are more goods. And then you can do a similar thing with knowledge, a similar thing with achievements. To weigh these things, you just rely on intuition. So it's like, okay, how happy do you have to be to make up for the other stuff? So you like, if a guy was just a little bit happier, but massively lacking in the other goods, his life would be less good. If he was just a little bit less having the other goods, or if he had just had the less good, the other goods a little bit less, but was much happier, he'd be better off, etc.
All right, that answers my question there. Thank you.
All right, have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too, sir.
All right, thanks for watching, everyone. Good meeting those of you that I met, and yeah, this was fun. I think I'll do it again. Thanks.